Us right now, I'd like to say, is Ian Collins, who's just arrived. Tell us what's happening on his show.
It's weird, the Fauci thing, by the way. I mean, it's so odd, isn't it? You get pardoned before you've actually been accused officially of anything. Well, the same with, you know... Just in case.
Yeah,
so if that doesn't flag your
family.
suspicions, I don't know what does.
I know.
Yeah, and of course the boy as well.
What are you talking about?
We're talking about Starmer. What should he have said? There's the question, really.
What could he have said?
What should he or could he have said at that time that, you know, supposedly inflamed...
I just think the guy's a busted flush already, less than 7 months in.
It's not great, is it?
No, it's really not great.
All of that and more, Julia.
Ian Collins, thank you so much. It's going to be a great show coming up. Big thanks to Tom Slater. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm done for the day. Back with you tomorrow. Goodness knows what's going to happen tomorrow. This is Talk. We are the home of common sense.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
Yeah, indeed. Good afternoon. Welcome to the programme. Welcome to the home of common sense. And thank you to Julia. She will pitch up again tomorrow morning at 10. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has declared the Southport murders a line in the sand for Britain while condemning the state failings and vowing to leave no stone unturned into the investigation as to how 3 young girls could have been murdered and many others still suffering from the horrific injuries of that day. We'll have details on that. And what should Keir Starmer have said at the time? Donald Trump's told Americans the golden age begins now after he's sworn in as the 47th president of the United States. He's been quick to get to work, announcing sweeping changes to immigration, the economy and justice. The boy of Capitol Hill is not mucking around. The Oval Office has never seen such activity. It's been dusty for about 4 years in there. We'll have more on that as well. And Labour has extended the deadline to deliver 40 new hospitals promised by the Tories for a decade. Now, That's clearly not going to be exactly as Boris Johnson had sold it, but we will see and watch with interest what the Labour government do. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. This is arguably, I mean, we know the disturbing details of what happened in Southport, and we don't need to go over the horror of that really again. The families were spared some of the further detail. They would have, of course, been aware, but to hear the clinical evidence in a clinical setting of a courtroom would have been horrendous for the families. They were spared that after a guilty plea. But I want to take you back to just after the 29th of July, when 3 girls were murdered and others, 10 attempted murders, others horribly injured. And of course, everybody that was there that day, their lives changed for good. And of course, what followed the very next day were the Southport riots, and we know what happened from there. Later that day, the police said they'd arrested a 17-year-old from the village nearby. They were not treating the incident as terror-related, and that's kind of where one of the problems began, along with social media. And if you remember at the time, the biggest news on social media was an invented name of somebody, which I think I'm right in saying was just a made-up Arabic phrase, but that was the name that went around the world to the tune of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people going, this is... And the other bit of misinformation was that this is a person that crossed the channel recently on a boat. And none of that was true. The riots took place. The police had arrested a 17-year-old. Almost immediately after the attack, social media falsely speculated the suspect was an asylum seeker who'd arrived back in 2023. There was also unfounded rumours that he was a Muslim. In fact, it was established at the time that he was born in Wales to Rwandan parents. Police urged the public not to spread unconfirmed speculation and false information. And of course, the following evening, just after people had attended a vigil for the victims, I mean, this was, if you ever wanted an example of how little those people who rioted knew and felt and how stupid they were, among other things, then there it is, right after the vigil, while a postcode away, people were remembering 3 little girls who'd been killed and others seriously injured. Brutal violence broke out, mostly near a local mosque. There were bricks, bottles, missiles, all sorts of other things. 27 police officers were taken to hospital. This is the same group of people, by the way, responsible, that got very animated when they thought police officers had got injured in an airport, had a very different view when they were smashing bottles in their face and goodness knows what. None of those people, I think most people, whether you're on the left or the right, would support the fact they do not represent you. If you're torching cars, if you're... And latterly, we know elsewhere, there were cases where people were stuck in hotels, things were set on fire, vandalism. It was horrendous. It was horrendous what happened, and we're aware of the details. There were other people on the sidelines, however, who kind of had a sort of a tacit sympathy with at least the outrage of, is there something we're not being told here? And that's the group of people that were written off as mad right-wingers, by the way, by this government. Keir Starmer couldn't stop saying it enough. I can buy into the people who initially caused riots and stuck 27 cops in hospital. I understand that. You know, these are people that had horrendous criminal records, half of them. They were not good people. They didn't really know what they were fighting for. Fancied a scrap. Yeah, let's have a scrap. Yeah, look, it's a bloody foreigner as a response. Blah, blah, blah. We know all of that. But the void, if there was a void, appears to be that Keir Starmer or somebody should have made an announcement to quash what was happening. And I've thought about this a lot because, I mean, the first point of call is I don't really want my Prime Minister getting too involved in court cases. I don't want him... That's meant to be a separate thing, right, from Parliament to the judiciary. Of course, there's something in the Venn diagram, but asking the leader of your country to make comments on a potential court case as it was then, I'm not sure that's the way to go. Now, you could argue, well, this was an extreme situation. You know, clearly there was an attack. It could have been terror-related. In the event, the person was not charged with terror-based killings. He was charged with other terror offences. So there's that. But what could or should Keir Starmer have said that would have made the blind bit of difference? I think that's the bit, absolutely genuinely, many stories we've covered over the years, I'm properly perplexed by that, and also stand to be educated on that, because personally I can't really see what Starmer could have said if he were to get involved that would have made any difference to the hundreds of people that broke out in violence in Southport the very next day. I don't know, was he meant to say the man's not an asylum seeker and he's not a Muslim? Would that people have then gone, all right, OK, so we're OK to riot then? Yeah, we're legitimately rioting because we've got other reasons to riot. Or would they have stopped rioting? I mean, what is it people wanted out of that? Because the one thing we have to protect, and bearing in mind, you have to remember we've got a Prime Minister that is just not very good at politics. I think we can all agree on that. He might feel he's on safe soil when he starts talking about the law, but as a politician, he's not that great. And there's countless examples of that. I don't need to educate you on why Keir Starmer isn't very good. I think we can all see that. But on this specific point, what was he supposed to do that he didn't do? And we'll play you that clip, which you will have heard a few times, in a few moments' time. 0344 499 1000. And what would it have changed had he said something else? Let's speak to Steve N. Allen, broadcaster and comedian with us on the programme. Steve, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you back. I mean, let's start there, shall we, on this disturbing story. Alex Ruda-Cabana unexpectedly pleading guilty yesterday to all charges. This was the first day of the hearing. He admitted the murder of 3 young girls, further attempted murder charges and terror-related offences. Sir Keir Starmer said in a statement this morning that he knew in the wake of the Southport attack that he had previously been referred to the Counter-Extremism Prevent. So let's have a little listen to what Mr Starmer had to say.
Yes, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice in a case such as this. But you know and I know that it would not have been right to disclose those details. The only losers, if the details had been disclosed, would be the victims and the families, because it ran the risk the trial would collapse.
Steve, I mean, he's right on that point, isn't he?
He's right in the general terms, right? This is why we have our contempt of court laws, and there are cases where cases have collapsed because of things that have been in the media. We know we've all been sent on the courses before you're allowed anywhere near TV or radio. Yep. For good reason, because what you don't want to do is say something that makes you, oh, look at me, I'm Mr. Big Tough Talk, and then some lawyer brings it up, look what's already been in the media, my client can't get a fair trial, off you trot. You don't want something like that happening. However, that's not always what we're talking about here. There must have been some information that could have been made public that in no way could have impacted the trial. Do you know the information of his place of birth? That could have come out because, like day one of a trial, the first thing that you have to do is agree to what is your name. You confirm your name and address. Yeah. So it's not like that's ever the contentious bit of a trial. And if we would have been given that information straight out the traps, then whoever set fire to a hotel with migrants in it were clearly on a different path, because that couldn't have been related to the case that everyone was upset about. So there would have been a clearer division between those who wanted to protest saying, look, some kids have died and we need to do something. As it turns out, we now know we need to do something about the Prevent system. But at the time, emotions were high, and then this rumour circles around on social media. Of course, we could have had some authority. You're right, it doesn't have to be the Prime Minister. He's meant to be busy unless it's after 6 o'clock on a Friday. But someone could have come out and said, look, we know this thing's going around on social media. We can say it is false, because that bit of information won't impact the outcome of a trial. I just think he was too much of a lawyer. He was thinking, I can keep all the information, we'll have a great trial, not realising how it would impact people who were feeling very emotional, and look what happened.
But does that mean then that if he'd have come out and said, you know, this is an asylum seeker who came across the channel 2 years ago, would that mean that all those people writing would have been legitimised in some kind of way? It would have been OK to set fire to things?
No, you're right. I'm never in favour of setting fire to hotels. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But it would have been clearer blue water between what you think you're doing, why you are wrong. That would have had some clarity on that. And it would have separated out the two groups. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. Because whenever this gets discussed, people like to do the false dichotomy thing of flipping to whichever side of the argument's going to give you most emotional points. So if you say, well, some far-right people like the idea of setting fire to a hotel. So the response is often, are you calling all of these people far-right, including the mothers who are upset about the young kids? Of course not. Within one set of people, there are subsets. And knowing who we were talking about would have separated out those two sets. So anyone wanting to do a protest about it, as I still believe now, is absolutely valid. What you don't want is right-wing people within that group who've got other motives getting the cover, getting the protection of being grouped up with people who had valid points.
I mean, there's many other facets to this as well. You know, Keir Starmer talking about, you know, the failure to prevent the murders by this man leaps off the page, and the case should be a line in the sand. Now, of course, this predates his government. I don't know how many times you have to be referred to prevent, how many times you have to kick off. We know this man had a violent past in other areas, his former school. This guy, I think the term loners and misfits was used by Keir Starmer. This is exactly this man, but a violent loner and a violent misfit, clearly, and it was quite evident he had that intent. I mean, that is a failure, right? That's a failure in our system. We seem to hear it all the time. I've lost count of how many terror attacks there's been when someone had gone, oh, they were known to the police.
Yeah. The idea that you can go through the prevent system a couple of times. I don't want to make too light of it, but I'm here to be vaguely glib, I suppose. I don't even like those stories when people pass their driving test on the 11th time, because I think you probably shouldn't be driving. If you failed that many times and passed on the 11th, you shouldn't be on the roads.
Yeah. The Daily Mail normally have a front page spread on that. You know, Muriel passes her driving test at 86, having tried 94 times. And you think, yeah, Muriel should not be in the same postcode as a car, let alone driving.
Exactly.
One.
So if you've been through the prevent system a couple of times and you keep coming back, why are we not taking the hint? I mean, that doesn't mean I know what the solution is.
Yeah.
But the solution isn't, let's wait until, you know, maybe the 11th one's the charm. No, that needs looking at. And hopefully that is what will be looked at.
Yeah. And it's important as well to distinguish between protesters and rioters, I think. You know, there were some people who sensed, and that might have been misplaced, might have been completely inaccurate, but there was a sense that, you know, something is wrong. You know, 3 kids, 3 little girls had been killed, 10 others almost killed, others maimed for life. No one in that room's ever going to forget this day. It's understandable people would be angry about that, and some of the people who took to the streets wouldn't have been there to throw anything, just really to show, you know, that something's wrong with our system when this kind of thing can happen.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago since we were talking about the right to protest, because it's been slightly impacted, hasn't it? The Tories brought in restrictions, and I would have been on places like here saying the right to protest is one of the most fundamental, because when something else changes, what are you going to do about it if you can't protest? So the right to protest is very important. Even if you were wrong, you've got the right to protest. And as it turns out now, the protesters weren't wrong. There is, you know, questions need to be answered.
Let's move across the pond where nothing bad is going to happen for the next 4 years, because the Donald is back. He's been sworn in. We covered it all yesterday. 47th President of the US following his inauguration. He's planned to sign hundreds of executive orders in the first few days. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Today I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. It's all about common sense.
Common sense. It's a phrase we use a lot. What's interesting about that is watching Joe Biden sitting right behind him as he's talking about the absolute carnage of the previous 4 years, and moves forward with a new beginning. But that's his intent. What do you think?
Yeah, it was awkward, isn't it? There were bits in that where I was thinking, mate, he sat right there. But Joe seems to be absolutely fine with it, because I guess he must have been sat there thinking, I don't know who this president is he's talking about, but whoever he was must have made a right mess of this. So when he finds out, he's going to be gutted. Yeah. But, I mean, look, at least he stopped some of the insults. Donald Trump normally puts the insult as like an adjective before the person's name, you know, crooked Hillary. He didn't call him Sleepy Joe, which is surprising, because I think he was
that would
asleep.
have been something, wouldn't it, if he literally had said, you know, this idiot behind me has been there for 4 years. I can't see what he's done. No, I can.
Sleepy Joe, and it cuts to Joe, and he's like this. Huh? That would have been fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah. Look, I mean,
dinner time. It's 11 in the morning.
Yeah, I quite enjoyed this speech. I'm not a Trump guy. And I should be allowed to say that. And I think it's going to be an interesting time. It doesn't matter which way it goes. Either he will end up being the caricature that the Democrats make out of him, and that's what we need to see. You need to let them have a good crack at it. Or some of these things will work. The problem is, there are two types of people in this world: those who think that everything Donald Trump does is bad, and those who think that everything he does is right, and they're both wrong. Which means there are three types of people in this world, because there's also me. So I was wrong before. But it does mean it's getting confusing now, isn't it? Like, no one can be right all the time or wrong all the time. Even Jesus made mistakes, I presume. Like when he turned water into wine, that water was the water that was used to clean people's feet. And someone must have said, like, mate, just there's fresh over there.
We've got some fresh stuff out the back.
Yeah.
What are you using?
I'm driving, so it's fine.
That's the footwell. No.
Yeah.
The good stuff's there.
So I think, that's going to happen. There will be stuff that Donald Trump does that's a good move.
True.
And people who have fundamentally died all the way through to the core, hating what he does. You just look, Donald Trump doesn't like war. You don't have to be pro-war now just because you don't like Donald Trump. I guess I am asking for common sense. Maybe that's the right phrase.
We're going to stay with Steve N. Allen. Thank you for joining us today, Steve. We're going to be back with more in a moment. We'll talk about Labour delaying those hospital rebuilds as well. Fly tipping. Oh, that's a right old favourite, that one, isn't it? Is back on the agenda. If you've been on the receiving end of some dodgy old smelly fly tippers, we're all ears, and we'll tell you what's been going on in one town of Lichfield in a couple of moments. Everything you need to know and all the breaking news, 0344 499 1000.
Now, official government policy in America that biology is a fact. That's quite encouraging, isn't it?
Well, it is. And one of the things that came out was that if you are overseas right now and want to get back into America, and if your passport does not specify your actual correct biological sex, you have to get your passport reissued and you do not get to come back in.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
24 minutes after 1. Ed in Nottingham says, Ian Collins, in fact, we almost had a sweepstake on who would be the first to, because the minute you throw a bit of nuance, or I'd like to think an intelligent, reasoned question, said at the beginning, stand to be educated here, somebody will always go, Starmer apologist. Ed hit the bullseye and got there first. He is, in fact, the only one so far. Starmer apologist, go work for the BBC, says Ed in Nottingham. It's not a case of a Starmer apologist, and I really think the level of debate here, Ed, is a little warmer and higher up the scale than that. It's asking the question, what could Starmer have done or said? Now, firstly, whilst, by the way, as an apologist, I didn't give him exactly a glowing CV when I said he's one of the worst politicians we've ever had. I can't think of very much good about him. Oddly, you mentioned the BBC. It was actually the BBC, I think, that first reported the guy was from Wales, which was exactly what people wanted to, the clarity that people were looking for. Regain Control says Starmer knew of the Southport terrorist details and withheld it from the public. He should resign. But it's not for a Prime Minister to give details of someone's iffy past if they've been arrested. I mean, that just potentially collapses a court case. Does he have to do that on every case now? If there's some mad, violent, serial offender who's out there on the streets and gets arrested, do we want Starmer to pop up on our TVs going, well, you might want to know, back in 2018, he also smashed a kid in the teeth at Cleethorpes? I don't think that's the way we want our system to work, is it? And it can't work that way. You know, trials have collapsed for less. 0344 499 1000. Let's move on to some other business. Steve N. Allen is with us, the comedian and the broadcaster. Interesting one here, Steve. Labour delaying almost half of those new hospitals promised by the Tories, delaying it by a decade. A record 3.4 million people in the UK will be living with cancer by the end of the year is the other new headline. We desperately need those hospitals. Let's have a listen to Wes Streeting talking about the delay.
In 2019, they told the British people that they would build 40 new hospitals over the coming decade. But there were never 40 new schemes, and many of them were extensions or refurbishments. Put simply, they weren't all new, some of them weren't hospitals, and there weren't 40 of them.
Well, whatever it was, however many there were, it's been delayed again, this time by the Labour government, Steve.
Yeah, and I know I'm going to upset you now by saying things mean about the Labour Party because you're a Starmer apologist.
Obviously,
but
yes.
I think this is, what was it, he called it one of the worst Prime Ministers we've ever had. You apologist.
Yeah, I know, that's right. Yes.
Imagine what his critics are saying.
Indeed.
But they'd be right, though, because this is terrible. You've got one job, especially when you campaign all the time on our healthcare system and your Labour. You've got to love the healthcare system. Wes Street, and give him credit where it's due. He's talking about reforming it. He's not just saying throw loads of money at it, make improvements. Some of his schemes, looking at hospitals that do things differently, and they seem to have success, copy that success elsewhere. Some of them, absolutely fine. But sweet mercy, we need to get these flipping hospitals. It was early this week or last week, the story about the state of the hospitals having people cared for and dying in corridors. Do you know what that tells you? You don't have enough rooms. So, yes, while you can complain that there weren't new hospitals, some of these were plans to have extensions built. Do you know what? I'll take that right now, if you actually do them. I mean, I had a birthday recently, so I'm starting to, getting a bit older. I'd love for some of these extensions to be built before I probably need them. Could we pull our finger out and get some of it done?
Yes. I mean, if I don't attend a hospital in my latter years and spend it in the Steve N. Allen suite, then there's something wrong, frankly, because I'd like to think they would name one after you, Steve.
They could name a corridor after me if they want. I'd be up for that.
Yeah, love it. And this one, we always like a fly tipping story in a curious kind of way, because fly tipping isn't really funny. But it's the unfathomable nature, I suppose, of fly tipping. The idea that somebody goes, what do I do with this sofa? I know where we put it, on the A21. That's a good idea. It's that kind of weird thinking. But in Lichfield, it's got really bad because a mountain of 100 tonnes of fly tip rubbish has been left near residents and homes. Let's hope, though, and this is one of our favourite clips. Let's hope it's not because this man has recently moved into the area.
Yeah, so you thought you were going to come and dump it here?
Yeah, no, I don't do that anymore. I leave it
But you,
in the van, don't worry.
Because look at all this, you see all this, everybody's been dumping all that stuff, and we've had enough, we've got rats, he's got rats.
He's got rats. Yeah, everyone's got rats. I love the guy who goes, oh, we don't do this anymore. Well, you did, because we just nabbed you red-handed, mate.
Yeah, of all the days to be nabbed, the day I was quitting anyway. Oh, what are the odds?
That's right. It was my last tip.
Yeah.
You got me.
I used to live, you know this as well, this is my dark, shameful past. I used to live in Gravesend, and there's a bit between the river and the canal, which is an industrial bit, part of the Saxon Walk, which is where I used to go for runs, and the fly tipping there was ridiculous. Yeah. Once, there was a car on its side that had been fly tipped there, and the impressive thing is, you couldn't have driven that car there. I don't know how on earth they manage. You've got to put effort in. These people who fly tip, if they put that level of effort and ingenuity into another thing, they'd be really good at it. And yeah, I think you're partially right. It's the mentality of like, what do I do with this? I'll dump it here. They're actually not the problem. That's the rare case of someone who's just a bit of a wrong and they fly tip a bit. The problem are these organisations, too much of a fancy word, these rip-off merchants who say, we collect your waste and take it down the tip for you. Yeah. And they don't. They collect your waste and then take the money and fly tip it. Part of the problem as well is how difficult it is to get rid of actual waste. Have you ever tried to throw anything away down the old recycling centre? They need to do a cavity search. They need your full dental history to throw like 3 bin bags. You can't do 4 bin bags, 3, and take the other one home with you. Ridiculous.
I was at the tip just this weekend, getting rid of an old wardrobe and a few shelves. I was down there. Absolutely love it down there. Love dropping the stuff off. And there was that moment where there's always somebody who goes, where do I put this, mate? And the fellow from the council looked at it, and he looked up at him in the eyes, and he said, is it a household? And he went, bulky. Because bulk is a separate skip from household, you see. You know, so you've got to get if you don't get it right. But there's these people in Lichfield, near Lichfield, an 80-foot long pile of fly tip rubbish. Apparently it's mostly building waste. So there's got to be a doorbell camera somewhere clocking the filthy tipper as they arrived in Watery Lane to drop off their ill-gotten gains.
Yeah, you're right, because we've never been so surveilled, have we? We're one of the most surveilled nations on the planet, and yet somehow people are getting away with this fly tipping. Yeah. It's ridiculous. The problem is, though, that down on Watery Lane, they'll dump this stuff off, they'll not get caught, and they'll be charging someone. There is no way that building waste is just someone who's got a car full of rubble for some reason, is it? That is someone who's making money out of it.
Spot on. Steve, thank you as ever. He is Steve Van Allen, the comedian, the broadcaster, looking at the big stories of the day. If you've been on the receiving end of the old fly tip ruse, I'm all ears at this end. Did you ever pay the man with the van? So, when somebody said, yeah, we'll collect your old one. I mean, that's straight away. If somebody's advertising that kind of stuff on an iffy Facebook page, you know they're probably a wrong one. But you see, you could pay the council 50 quid or you could pay matey 20 quid and you got a few drop-offs you need doing. That's why people go in that direction. We're talking about Starmer. I'm intrigued to know, what did you want Keir Starmer to have said during at the time that the Southport riots were happening on the back of that horrendous, murderous spree by Alex Rudikubana? 3 girls died, were killed, other attempted murders, still suffering from those injuries, lives blighted forever for anybody that was there. But the central accusation between the rioting and the horrific incident is that it happened because we weren't told enough detail. I'm crudely summing it up there. What is the detail that was needed? Which, by the way, it would have had to have come, for my money, from a senior police officer and not a Prime Minister. I don't know the Prime Minister wading in I know certain things get so big that it becomes a prime ministerial issue, and maybe this was one of those things. But broadly speaking, we want politicians to butt out of court cases, right? 0344 499 1000. Over to you in a few moments. We'll also talk to Luke Gittos, the lawyer, who's written a piece on this for Spiked Online. It's an interesting take that he's got on it. We'll get his interpretation of what could have happened or should have happened in just a couple of moments. 0344 499 1000.
across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
It is Talk 25 to 2. Loads of comment coming in from you. This one from Michelle. I don't think you're a Labour apologist, by the way. She says, but we should have been informed of the truth that this young man had an Al-Qaeda manual, was making rice in immediately. So many have been locked up for knowing he was a terrorist. But I think with respect to Michelle's words, I get that. I'd like to get all those details on court cases, but on somebody's past. But that comes up in a court case, right? And then when he was charged with that, we did find out. I don't know whether we can expect an immediacy around every detail in a case, but I can see the desire to have it. This is Alex Rudabakana, responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history, Yvette Cooper has declared. She set out details for a public inquiry into the Southport attack, the Home Secretary told the Commons. She's ordered a thorough review of Rudabakana's referrals to the Prevent Anti-Terror Programme to, quote, identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed. Let's have a listen to what the Home Secretary said. This is in the last 10 or 15 minutes.
It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definition set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face.
Well, this comes as Keir Starmer admitted knowing about Rudabakana's terror links, but says he couldn't make the information public due to concerns over prejudicing a trial. Let's speak with Luke Gettos, lawyer, a writer and director of the Freedom Law UK. Luke, afternoon to you. I mean, this has every bit of ingredient, doesn't it? It's got information, it's got misinformation, it's got emotion, which is at the centre of all of this as well. Is the question we've been throwing out, what should the Prime Minister have said? Yvette Cooper clarifying their current position. What is your take on this? And I know you wrote a really interesting piece for Spiked Online on this point back in November. What was missing from this story?
Well, I think we learnt everything that we could learn at the time that we could have learnt it. It was a very long-winded way of saying that there were obviously really strict rules around what could and couldn't be said about this case when the defendant was first arrested. And if these details, such as the fact that he was found with a terror manual, the fact that he had tried to produce ricin, if these details had made it into the public realm, then Keir Starmer is right to say that that could have put a trial at risk. The real risk being that he could never be tried fairly because of the potentially inadmissible material that couldn't or shouldn't have been heard by the jury getting into the public domain. His defence lawyers would then have had a very good argument to say, well, this guy can't be trusted fairly because there is so much inadmissible material in the public realm. We can't hope to have a fair jury for him. And perhaps it's egging it slightly highly to say that that would have completely prevented him being tried and him walking as a free man. I think that's probably unrealistic. But nonetheless, it would have created real difficulty for the trial judge, for the trial lawyers, and it would have created a lot of problems. So I think what the public inquiry will probably reveal, and it's always dangerous to hedge your bets like this, but I imagine that Keir Starmer, he is if he is one thing, he's definitely a lawyer. He knows the law inside out. He will have known at the time what he could and couldn't say. He would have been advised properly on it, and I think that's probably what will emerge in the inquiry. What is more interesting here is, I think, what the inquiry is going to uncover about motive, about what kind of state agencies dropped the ball when it came to this individual, whether or not this is properly described as a terrorist incident. You know, what we are seeing is some real umming and ahhing about whether to describe this as a terrorist incident, because the police are still refusing to do so. Yeah. It looks like there is conflicting evidence about precisely what Rudabakana's motive was. We know that he downloaded a terror manual that looks like it could be clear cut, but of course he also attempted to commit a knife rampage at his old school 4 years ago in response to being bullied. So this is someone who looks like he responds to, you know, emotional upset with monstrous and extreme violence. So we may not know whether this is a terror incident or not. It would not have been right for Keir Starmer to come out and say at the time, well, this is definitely a terrorist incident, because there just wasn't the evidence to suggest that there was. And I think those people that are claiming vindication, particularly online now, saying, well, here you go, we knew all along this was connected with terror and we've been proved right, I think they're probably speaking a little bit too soon, because Rudy Cabana looks like a very deeply troubled individual, probably motivated by all sorts of things that we might not even know about yet. He looks like a sort of basement-dwelling individual who doesn't appear to be attached to any particular political cause. You know, there is some information that he was raised Catholic, but beyond the connection to the Al-Qaeda manual, there's nothing to suggest he was interested in Islam or radical Islam or anything similar. So it's right to say that it's still the case that a lot of misinformation was circulated after this chap was arrested, and that is dangerous, and that's
I was just going to add into that, Luke. You know, doing this job as a journalist and working in newsrooms, you know, you do get bits of information from journalists that are on the ground. They'll speak to a police officer off the record. You know, those kind of conversations do go on, and you hear rumblings. I remember hearing the rumblings of, you know, they found things in his house, not specifically what, but that could link him to terrorism. But then the next thing I heard was the reason they're not talking about that is because they need to establish, was this guy linked to somebody else in the terror network? And had they let that information be known, that could have scuppered another trial somewhere else. There's all of this stuff. There's a good reason why information doesn't come out, because it can lead to lots of misinformation. It can lead to collapsing a trial, or certainly bolstering a defence case over a trial for things that become, as you rightly say, inadmissible. And so that's the reason we have these laws in place. And I get that. There is still a sense, though, that when Starmer said, you know, I couldn't have said anything, is there something he could have said? Could he not have said, look, there's a lot of information this guy arrived on a Channel boat? He didn't. There's a lot of information he's an illegal immigrant. He isn't. We can say that much. Or does that then get into the realms of, hang on, running commentary from Prime Minister every time there's an incident?
Yeah, I think that's what they will be balancing at the time that these kind of incidents occur. They're attempting to balance satiating the public, the legitimate public demand for information, with the need to keep things private and to make sure that they don't have an impact on other investigations or other potential criminal cases. I mean, as you suggest, you know, there were rumblings at the time that he'd been found with particular documents, and maybe Keir Starmer should have said more, but this will come out in the public inquiry. I think so far he's broadly trod the correct line. And I do think, you know, we must remember that in the aftermath of this incident, there was a fake name circulating about who this attacker was. Yeah. There was fake information, specific information, that he'd arrived on a boat during 2023 as an asylum seeker. All turned out to be completely false. And so there is a justifiable concern that outright lies and misinformation can circulate very quickly. But I do think governments in the future will be more wary of the need to give the public something in order to make sure there's no vacuum into which that misinformation can step, because I think that's what happened here. It was the silence from the government and from the state agencies that allowed this information to start circulating.
And the other point that doesn't get talked about very much, of course, is when this incident happened, he was legally still a child, the perpetrator here. So that presumably would have had a factor on events. It might have been different had it been an adult, I don't know. And of course, he was never charged. The murders he was charged with were not terror related, and that's interesting. I mean, lots of people say, well, hang on, sometimes the police do say we're treating this as a terror incident. Other times it's not a terror incident. I'm trying to think where there was one recently, I think it was in another country, where they said initially it's a terror. It was in America, wasn't it, when there was an incident there. It's a terror incident. No, it's not a terror incident. Oh, yeah, it is a terror. No, we aren't. Yes, we aren't. No, there's a lot of that goes on depending on who you speak to. The FBI say one thing, the New York Police Department say another, etc. So you always have these problems. Anne makes this point, though, Luke. She says, knowing it's a terror-related crime means you can be on alert for more attacks. Misinformation from overseas contributed to the riots. I felt it was implied that the perpetrator was a young, angelic choir boy who possibly had mental health issues. Well, I think people said that online. I don't know if anybody officially said that. But is it useful to know that it could be a terror attack, because that bolsters our awareness that, you know, there might be a new vibe or a new group out there somewhere, or is that also dangerous?
Well, look, the legal test for classifying an incident as terrorist-related or a terror incident in the eyes of the state is about motivation. It's about why the person has carried out this crime. And it triggers certain other steps to be taken by the relevant state agencies. So that's why that designation is important. And I think the reason why this attack hasn't been designated in that way is because we're still unsure of his precise motive. And those motives look mixed and complicated. You know, this is very different to something like the Woolwich terror attack, the stabbing of Lee Rigby, where Michael Adebolajo stood in the middle of the road shouting jihadist slogans immediately after the attack. There was no doubt in that incident that this was motivated by jihadism. But that's not the case here. And so the police and the relevant agencies can't just designate an incident a particular way because they think it will satisfy the public. Yeah. And they can't do it because they just want to appear to be doing the right thing. They need to do it because it's justified. And in this case, it wasn't.
A lot of people have said, well, what about the photo of this guy? Why did we not see the photo? In fact, Dallas has just said, what influence did Keir Starmer have on the censorship of the picture of the killer looking like a total raving psycho rather than the totally innocuous one from his child? Well, Starmer wouldn't have had any influence on that at all. But, of course, once the guy had been arrested and it was clear something was going on, they wouldn't be showing that photo. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's easy to forget that when this case started, there were strict reporting restrictions over his name, because he's a child. And ordinarily, as we've seen in a few cases recently, one thinks of the killing of Brianna Ghey, which involved two underage defendants. It's not normal to publish a defendant's identity, their name, and certainly not their photograph. So those reporting restrictions had to be lifted, which they were, by the court. It had nothing to do with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer would have no legal power whatsoever to put these images into the public realm or to censor them. Those were legal restrictions that always apply when it comes to the trial of a child. And of course, the fact that Ruda Kavana was a child when he committed these awful crimes will affect the sentence that he eventually receives, because he won't be allowed to have what's known as a whole life order, an order of the court that puts him into custody for the rest of his life. That he would need to be over 21 in order for that to be passed. So in all the monstrous characteristics of this, it's just the case that there are certain rules that govern the trial of children.
But even when he was, I was just going to say, look, even when he was named, because he was just shy of his 18th birthday, and I think the name would have probably come out, I mean, sometimes in some circumstances, as you know, as a lawyer, a name will be released, but usually after a trial. But he was about to be 18, they did release his name, but they never released that mugshot. I think I'm right in saying that would have potentially been seen as prejudicial as well, had they done so. And the fact that at that stage he'd been charged with murder, many counts of murder, would be the reason why it wasn't in the public domain, not because anyone was covering up what looks like a man who does the kind of thing he turned out to do.
Yeah, it's perfectly normal for a mugshot image like this to be kept back from the public, principally because it's evidence in the case. So the mugshot photograph is a formal exhibit in the court case. It will be put before the jury to be considered. You know, we didn't see Lucy Letby's mugshot, the now famous mugshot, until after she was convicted. You remember, for a long time, the only photo we had of her was a relatively innocuous one. So that again is perfectly normal. And I think people are justifiably alarmed by the mugshot photograph because it's an extremely striking image. He looks very, very different to the images that we had previously. And that probably gives you some insight into why these photos aren't put into the public realm, because defense teams and prosecution teams need to hash this out in court before it gets public. There are sensitive legal questions around what is fair and what is not to put before a jury, and it's right that the people involved in those trials resolve them without outside influence.
There it is, Luke. Thank you. Very thorough stuff, Luke Gittos, lawyer, writer and director of the Freedom Law UK. Thank you to him. Over to you. Is there anything, even allowing for all the kind of legal considerations, which I think do, respectfully, and understandably, by the way, it doesn't, we had a lot of people very innocently say, well, why didn't we know this or why didn't we know that? And there are usually good reasons. I can remember the classic case of Baby P. And remember the horror, this poor boy that was killed by those that were, including his own mother, or I think the legal term is responsible for his death. No one was charged with murder over that. So you have that awful thing. And they were anonymous for a while, and people were saying, you should release the names. Why isn't the Prime Minister, why isn't the Home Secretary, why isn't the police releasing the names of these people? Why protect them? And of course, the reason they weren't releasing the names is because there was a further court case still to be done, which would have completely collapsed, 100% would have collapsed a secondary court case if the people on the jury knew that the people they were trying were responsible for the death of Baby P. It could never have happened. That was why it was anonymous. It wasn't to do them a favour or a political decision. 0344 499 1000. Over to you, coming next on Talk.
This is a fundamental systems failure of epic proportions. I think what really concerned me, Mike, was the lack of warmth and affection on his trip to Southport.
Yeah.
It was very robotic. The lack of empathy was very robotic and mechanical for me. And I think that you're talking about a very quiet, traditional seaside town in on Merseyside. And they're suffering this horrific atrocity. And the Prime Minister went up there, and I think for me, he displayed a real lack of leadership.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
This one comes in from Lorraine, who says Luke Gittos has completely misread the room. With respect, I don't think he's there to read rooms. He was there to lay down what the law of the land is. It's not his opinion, it's just the matters of fact. It is clear there was enough evidence that it was a terror-related crime. The public were lied to and deliberately misled by the Prime Minister and his inept Home Secretary. There's been censorship, and that is not democracy. The law is clear on information that cannot be given, and Starmer is gaslighting, as is Mr. Gittos. The anger after Starmer's speech is palpable. Well, I'm asking the question, what should then Starmer have said? Because the law of the land is that he shouldn't be saying anything, and didn't, really. I think what got people was that there was a horrendous and murderous, barbaric attack on children, and a sense that the Prime Minister's only words, I know this comes a few days later, was about right-wing rioters. And no information about the... And, of course, there's a false correlation being made there in many respects, because those riots kicked off initially via misinformation. And I don't think, no matter how angry you are, setting fire to things and wanting to kill people, I don't think is the answer to... or the response to what happened. But what is, I mean, Luke's not gaslighting anybody. He's just saying this is the law and how it is, and these are the reasons we don't do this, because otherwise, what do we have? Keir Starmer, every time there's a big criminal case, do we want the Prime Minister to give a running commentary on it? I mean, genuinely, I said at the beginning, I stand to be educated. What could he have said? Dan's in Portsmouth. What are your thoughts on this one? Dan, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Right, I'm not going to start off by agreeing with what went on during the summer, but when you just said there, you know, setting fire to things and breaking things and messing things up isn't the way to deal with it. It's not the right response. However, tell that to someone who lives in a community blighted by, you know, huge illegal immigration, maybe grooming gang scandals. These riots didn't happen in the Cotswolds. They didn't happen in Cornwall. They happened in inner city places where these people are living with this day in, day out. Now, it might not always be the terrible murder of young girls, but it's a lot of terrible things that do go on, and people have had enough. Now, if you say, what can Keir Starmer have done? What should he have said? Well, at best, at worst, he should have said nothing, kept his nose out of it. But at best, what he shouldn't have done was told people who are sick with a certain ideology and a certain culture blighting their lives. What he shouldn't have done was put all the blame on the far right again and again and again. Because what that was doing was saying that the riots, as bad as they were worse than the crime. Now, I'm not going to stand up for those people that are rioting, but I understand why they did it. People are angry and they're sick of it.
But there was a kind of false connection, though, Dan, wasn't there? If you're the Prime Minister, bearing in mind, but as a Prime Minister, the last thing you want are more riots, OK? The last thing you want is for the whole country to riot.
Well, what I would say is the first riot kicked off, as far as I'm aware, the first riot kicked off, it may have been misinformation, it may have not have been, but there was a man found with a knife a block away from the vigil, which is what sparked the initial riot.
Yeah, I'm not absolutely sure there's any evidence of that. I keep reading that on social media, but I've yet to identify the individual.
Well, that's what I think about that. But let me just make one other final point for you, right? And that's this. When you were saying earlier, and that solicitor guy, you were saying that, you know, you can't talk about the case, it will collapse it, you can't give any evidence, you can't be...
Or compromise
What about the guys that... What about the guy that was filmed getting taken from an aeroplane, all right? He hadn't been found guilty of anything, but he was filmed being arrested on a plane. What about the fact that Starmer himself took the soapbox night after night, labelling everybody involved in this as actual card-carrying members of the far right? That was what was stoking it. There were a million things he could have said, and he said about the worst thing he could night after night. He took everything away from what we all knew had gone on, and basically all he wanted to talk about was this imaginary movement.
What would you have called people that were... I mean, 27 cops ended up in hospital after that night. What would you have called those people?
Well, I'd like to think if I was in Starmer's shoes, obviously it's not going to happen. Listen to the way I speak, for goodness sake.
You never know.
He can't speak to people. He needed to have somebody who can...
He's an awful politician, I understand that.
Speak to common people in a language they understand.
Yeah. I'm not sure he could ever go there, because he wouldn't know how. Dan, passionate stuff. Dan in Portsmouth with us on the programme. More comment from you coming up on the other side of the news at 2.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
Good afternoon. Yeah, 3 minutes after 2 o'clock. Welcome back to the programme. Lots to come. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says that Axel Ruda-Cabana is responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes this country has ever seen. She set out details for a public inquiry into the Southport attacks. We'll continue to take your calls and comments on that. Also this afternoon, Donald Trump's told Americans the golden age begins now after he was sworn in as the 47th US president. And he's been quick to get to work, announcing sweeping changes to immigration, the economy and justice. He ain't messing around, is our Donald, and big support he has, not just in America, for some of those moves. Meanwhile, over here, you want to see a different gear change of the kind of politicians we've got? Rachel Reeves is poised to back a third runway at Heathrow Airport in a bid to revive Britain's flatlining economy. How does that work with her net zero evangelist? I mean, thank goodness for the runway, by the way, but I'm not a net zero evangelist. She is. Details on the way. 0344 499 1000. Dan says, Ian, you're being deliberately dismissive. There's been plenty of court case happily carried on when a government announcement of a terror-related incident has occurred. The people just wanted the truth, not the intricacies of the case. Stop going on about us not being allowed to know facts. There can still be an honest announcement. Well, there has been cases where someone is charged with a terror-related incident. In this particular case, bizarrely, don't ask me how this works, I'm not defending anything, but Ruda-Cabana wasn't charged with terror-related murder. He was charged with murder, and there's differences between the two. He was charged with other terror-based incidents, but that was way down the line, if you remember. It's months and months later that we got the stuff about the Ricin and the Al-Qaeda manual. That certainly didn't come out at the beginning at all. There were some rumblings out there. But interestingly, at the beginning of a case, sometimes the police, forget the Prime Minister, and I can think of the killing of Joe Cox, which I think was described initially as a terror-related incident. I think I'm right in saying that the murderer of Joe Cox wasn't eventually charged with a terror-related incident. I may have that wrong. Keith Palmer, the police officer in Westminster, I think possibly that was a terror. I mean, look, there's no one-size-fits-all, but the terror bit was never going to come out at that point, even if you did know about it. Because that wasn't something that was released for other reasons, which is the reasons to follow, you know, this man's got an Al-Qaeda manual. Well, that might mean nothing, bizarrely, and possibly will never mean anything. He's, you know, the loner and the misfit and the violent killing kind of psychotic character that we know he is, might be where the story starts and ends. But at the time, I can tell you for a fact, the minute they would have found anything terror-related, they would have gone, right, we need to find out who else this guy's linked to. And if it turns out there's something bigger, was he part of a bigger plot? And all of that does take some time. I don't have a problem as a member of the public with not knowing that information. And I think the idea that if I don't know that information, I should be able to just then make it up in my head and start going nuts in the street. I do think Dan, our last caller, by the way, from Portsmouth, hit on something which I know some of you listening to my response to this is not everybody's flavour of response, but it is the only response, by the way. It's not an opinion. I'm simply laying out what the facts are. If the facts should change, or if the law should change, then naturally that's fine. We run with it. I've got loads of questions about the government and the Prevent programme, and a shed load more for the previous government, by the way. When this man was clearly flagged to the system, nothing happened. And even Starmer, by his woeful abilities, wasn't in charge then, we would have had a succession of other Home Secretaries, possibly Suella Braverman. Maybe it could have been Sajid Javid. It might well have been James Cleverly. You know, all of these people had that position. They would have also known about that information back at the time with the Prevent programme. But the overarching thing of this particular case is the person responsible was, bizarre as it sounds, a child in the eyes of the law. So we were never going to get very much anyway. When you're a 17-year-old, you still have a certain level of anonymity around some things. His name did eventually come out because he turned 18, and I think that came out largely to perhaps stop some of the speculation. Let's get a word on this and the other big political stories of the day. Candice Holdsworth is with us, the writer and the broadcaster. Candice, afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
Good to have you with us. I mean, there's some disturbing stories here, and listening to Yvette Cooper setting out plans for a public inquiry, something she couldn't bring herself to do for the mass grooming and raping of thousands of young girls, but she's managed it for this.
Yeah, she has. I watched her speech in the House of Commons, and I just thought, she's just not hitting the right notes. You know, I think people have just lost. There's such a huge loss of faith and trust in politicians, in local authorities, in social services, in so many of these sort of public bodies that are there to manage these situations. And I just don't think the public trusts them to do it. You know, they think there'll be an inquiry, but it won't do anything. That's how people see things, you know. They don't think that the right questions will be asked or the right answers will be given. I think although people do want an inquiry for the grooming gangs, I do think that there is a skepticism sometimes about inquiries.
Yep.
People sometimes view them as just like whitewashing or a way for governments to just draw a line under things and sort of not have to deal with the difficult issues that these things raise.
I mean, the system is clearly broken when somebody can be referred to the PREVENT programme on 3 occasions. Is the counter-terrorism scheme. The case was not referred onwards. Why, nobody can yet answer. We know he had an interest in school shootings, the London Bridge terror attack. All of this information was known by the authorities. And we're going to get the same story that we've had so often. It was how many times, you know, when it's a death of a child, often it's those kind of cases where a sort of baby P sort of story happens. And of course there was one more recently that gripped the nation with the level of horror, and you realise that the dots were not joined up. How many times do we hear that as the reason? You know, that agency didn't speak to that agency, they didn't pass it on to them. And the Tories were in charge, by the way, when a lot of this was going on.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you know, some of the things that have emerged are very disturbing, you know, that he went on a rampage at his old high school and had to be physically restrained. I mean, he was being cared for at home. One thing that came out was that, you know, he'd gotten into a taxi before, like a few days before, and his father had come out and convinced the taxi driver not to take him. I mean, he was becoming increasingly isolated. I mean, we've seen a number of cases like this of men who, you know, seem to be, you know, channeling, you know, a lot of dysfunction and isolation and alienation into this violence. And, you know, it's not necessarily that they're Islamists or, you know, might have an interest in terror and they might show an interest in violence, but it's not necessarily that they're going to go off and join ISIS. And, you know, there's all these sort of vectors online in various places that the increasingly alienated are finding a way to express their anger. And this is a very new phenomenon. I mean, all these rampage killings and school shootings and various things. I mean, these things, you know, never occurred before in the last, you know, this is a new thing. This is a thing that's very specific to our time. And I think we need to try and, like, understand what it is, like, what's driving this. You know, you can't, I think it's inadequate for the authorities to just, like, try and manage it by monitoring the internet or having a PREVENT program. I think we need to look at the deeper meaning, you know, what is going on here?
And I also think that if Keir Starmer is serious about a line in the sand, which was the phrase he used this morning, and clearly the system is broken and, you know, we need to keep our country and our children safe, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but these are the kind of words he used, then he might want to take a look at the English Channel, where hundreds of people, who we have no idea who they are, mostly young men, are coming over to our country without any identification, clearly from some countries that I think on any other day of the week would be of interest in this area. And yet that gets a free pass. I mean, I don't know how anybody... I struggle to know how we take Keir Starmer seriously on any day of the week, but particularly today. Surely there is a... I'm not suggesting, by the way, everybody who comes over on a boat is a criminal. I don't for one second... I'd imagine most of them are not criminals. However, you only need one or two.
Yes.
The fact is they are unidentified males coming into our country from some iffy regimes and places. I think we need to know who they are.
Well, yes, and I think that's just a very natural human reaction. I mean, this is our home. We build communities where we live, and we want to sense of belonging. And as you say, if you just have lots of people coming in, you don't know who they are. Even on a subconscious level, I mean, we're saying it explicitly. You're going to feel less safe. You're going to feel less trust in your environment. And if you perceive the politicians and the authorities who are supposed to be managing the system as weak, as not doing their job, that's going to lead to such frustration. And I do feel that there is a huge loss of trust. And I think it's, obviously it was directed at the Conservatives in the last election. I mean, there was huge anger at the Conservatives and the way that they'd mismanaged this. And this is partly why Keir Starmer got elected. It was a very weird election in many ways, but now it's been directed at Keir Starmer because I think the malaise goes it just goes so much deeper. People just don't feel that what we've got people feel that the system has just become chaotic, that it's, we're sort of living in a time of real unraveling.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one, by the way, from Rob in Preston, who says, how can Starmer label all the protesters and rioters as far right, but does that not impact on a future trial? Because calling it a terror attack does. Two-tier, I would say. That's a really good point, actually. I mean, people who were, OK, you might have been literally caught red-handed, rioting or doing something awful, but you might have just been hanging around in the street. And then, there would be a reasonable suggestion that if you were going to plead not guilty, you might get a jury trial, and that jury would already be aware that you've been labelled as a far-right agitator. That's a fair point from Rob.
It is a fair point. I think as well, some people pointed out at the time that there'd been tweets from certain government bodies implying that these people were criminals before they'd even been convicted. So, I mean, a certain level of incautiousness when it came to discussing the rioters. I mean, I don't know if you read Fraser Nelson's really interesting column in the Times this weekend. It was, really, really, kind of presaged the conversation that we're having today. Yeah. And he was saying that, Keir Starmer needs to decide if he's a lawyer or a politician because he's got very strong lawyerly instincts, which is fine. But in a situation like this, you need to be a statesman. He's a very process-driven guy, and that's absolutely fine. But I think in a moment of extreme tension and emotion like that, you have to come in and you have to reassure people somehow, even just dispelling myths, even if that's just it, just sort of saying something like, listen, we need to gather all the facts. I don't want to prejudice a trial, but can I just say the information that's online about this guy is false. It is categorically false. Just things like that. But, I mean, we never got any of that.
Yeah. True enough. Let's move to this story, which I think has probably discombobulated the government behind the scenes, because Rachel Reeves is expected to back a third runway at Heathrow when she gives a speech on growth. They want to boost economic growth, including supporting the expansion at Gatwick and Luton airports. Of course, the problem there is that the expansion faces opposition. People like Ed Miliband and Sadiq Khan voicing strong objections. This could end in tears for somebody.
It could. This is the only thing they've got. They have to reassure the markets. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have to reassure the markets now. And the thing that the markets are most sceptical about is growth. Yep. Britain is projected to have very, very poor growth, and the budget that they announced, I mean, with the raising of employers' national insurance, that's not going to help things. So unless they course correct in some way, markets are going to continue to be negative. Yeah. And I mean, Margaret Thatcher faced this in her first budget. Geoffrey Howe, her first chancellor, she had all this market turmoil, and they had to take measures to reassure them, and they were able to do that. I mean, you have to be pragmatic. If they're not pragmatic about this, disaster awaits them.
And also Rachel Reeves on the list for this story too. She's aiming to convince global elites at Davos that the UK is a safe investment destination. She's there along with Others talking at the World Economic Forum, everyone's favourite economic forum. I mean, there's loads around. There's the Cleethorpes Economic Forum, doesn't get the same kind of level of spotlight. I'm sure there's a Bromley one somewhere. There's one in Mexico. But the World Economic Forum is the biggie. That's the bullseye of economic forums, Candice. And she's going to tell all those big boys and girls over there with their billions of pounds, the UK is the place to be.
Yeah.
Can she do it?
Well, I mean, so far they've driven away a lot of the wealthy. I mean, there was some headlines this week saying just how many millionaires Britain is losing. I mean, it's sort of developing a reputation for not being the place you want to be if you've got money. And I think that they've set the wrong tone from day one. They just had no idea how to create any sort of positivity. They just created a gloom and doom outlook. But then it wasn't just about the mood that they created. I mean, they've taken very, very specific measures in their budget, which I think will make people skeptical of wanting to invest here. I mean, it's so much harder now to hire people. I mean, it does speak to economic incompetence. And yes, they can try and course correct now, and they can try and manage the situation,
sure,
and they can try and convince everybody. But I think people have lost trust and lost faith.
It couldn't be in more of a contrast to Donald Trump, whatever anybody thinks of Trump. But listening to over the last, I mean, he's done this for a couple of years in the build-up to this, to the election last November. But since he's been president, in the last couple of days, you know, we're reopened, we're back for business. It's a new beginning for America. You know, we're starting again. And I thought that was a genius line. That I'm slightly paraphrasing what he said, but it was essentially, you know, we're rebuilding, we're beginning from the off, as it were. And I just thought the positivity around that. Sort of Boris Johnson did that stuff rather well.
Yes.
I don't know whether this government does any of that at all, frankly.
I don't think they know how to do it. I mean, you know, they sort of they said stuff like clearing out the rot, you know, making the tough decisions.
Yeah.
But what were those tough decisions?
True.
I mean, it was stuff like taking away the winter fuel allowance for pensioners.
Yeah, messing around with the farmers, winter fuel allowance. God, I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it?
Yes, whilst making no attempts for welfare reform, not looking at the size of the state because they're afraid to take on the public sector unions. I mean, it all just rang really, really hollow. And you're right, you know, I mean, like, you know, someone like Boris Johnson understands that you know, you do present a positive vision. You have to help people feel hopeful about the future. I mean, we are living in a time where people are scared, are negative, and you have to show that you have a way out of that, a practical way out of that.
Indeed. Candice, thank you, as ever. Candice Holdsworth, the writer and broadcaster, having a chat about the big stories of the day. Over to you. Anything you've heard there, by the way, and the other big stories of the day. Also back to Southport and the almost the conclusion of a court case after those guilty pleas yesterday. A sentencing will take place, we understand, on Thursday this week. We're left with looking back at what should have happened, could have happened, etc. Many blaming the Prime Minister. He should have said something. What the Keir Starmer should have said something at the time. But what should he have said? I thought this was interesting from Chris. It's not about what he could have said. He just needed to say that the event was atrocious and the police were investigating and ensuring the public of justice and not divide and insult the general public, correct rumours or cancel them. And Craig says, why did journalists at the press conference this morning not ask the question, do you regret using the term far right to describe outraged citizens? I'll come back to that point, Craig, in a moment, because I'm still in my head digesting the call, which I thought was a great call from Dan in Portsmouth just before the news, and we hit the news, so we didn't get a chance to kind of chew it over a bit. I think there's more to say on what Dan mentioned in his very powerful call earlier on. 0344 499 1000, 21 minutes after 2. This is Talk.
This is a fundamental systems failure of epic proportions. I think what really concerned me, Mike, was the lack of warmth and affection on his trip to Southport.
Yeah.
It was
Lack
very
of empathy.
robotic. A lack of empathy is very robotic and mechanical for me. And I think that you're talking about a very quiet, traditional seaside town in on Merseyside. And they're suffering this horrific atrocity. And the Prime Minister went up there, and I think for me, he displayed a real lack of leadership.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
I think one of the problems with the debate about the riots being a reaction to Southport, I think there's more than one thing going on here, and I said this almost daily at the time. What happened in Southport initially after I thought it was extraordinary that anybody, even if they wanted to tear the place up, would choose, pretty much the same night as a vigil to do so, whatever reasons are given or justifications are given. And what happened was ugly. And when those similar scenes were repeated elsewhere, they were also ugly. And I don't have a problem, as Julia and Mike both said today, in writing those specific people off under a category. I'm not going to say, I don't know whether far right or far left. I don't care about titles. Anyone who was doing bad stuff, knocking coppers out with glass bottles, setting fire to things, threatening to kill people, God knows what else. I think that's a whole separate group from others. That's the others, which I think is most other people who extrapolated a very different narrative from this. And I said at the time, and it was hard to kind of articulate the best, and it still is in a way, the riots and those doing bad things, no one is endorsing that. That was terrible. But oddly, and that's maybe the only word, oddly or curiously, it acted as a catalyst for a kind of wider debate. You wouldn't normally stumble on that debate this way, but we did, and we couldn't reverse it. So we then have another debate, and that's when Starmer, writing people off as right-wing nutters, essentially those that have a concern of 30,000 people coming across a channel, those that have a concern about illegal immigration, those that have a concern about grooming gangs, anyone that has a concern about that kind of stuff, therefore must be a right-wing nutjob. That's what then happened. In the same way, I'm bound to add that when Black Lives Matter kind of came to prominence, been around for years, by the way, but came to prominence after the George Floyd death in America, and people started tearing the place up, setting fire to things. There were towns that were on fire. It was horrendous. Businesses closed down. People either injured, maimed or killed. And there were some commentators at the time, and I think, I might be wrong, it could be, again, a social media myth, that Keir Starmer said at the time, you have to understand why people are angry. Got a different tune now, mate. Mark's in Lincolnshire on this point of what Starmer could have said or should have said. Mark, afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. I just think that Keir Starmer could have come out and said, or not said that we're all far right. He was the one that kneeled down to that Black Lives
Matter. Yeah, good point.
And he's calling us all far right. We're asking for a debate about the rape gangs, and he's calling us all far right again.
But that predated the. You're correct, by the way, in what you just said. But specifically after Southport, when he was referring to rioters.
Yeah. I don't condemn what they did. My brother was a police officer. when the Brixton riots were on and he was involved in all that. I don't condemn any of that. I don't think anybody should do any of that. That's not right. But he should have let the police say something, and he was the one stopping them. They knew who he was. They knew what his name was.
They could. He was a child. They can't name somebody of that age.
Yeah, but he didn't long then turn 18, and he could have come out. They could have come out.
Yeah, but if you commit the offence as a child, you are entitled to anonymity. But his name did come out, I think, largely to try and quash the rumours, maybe.
Well, I don't know about that. I didn't hear that bit, and that. I just know that he always calls us far right, but when it's anything to do with him, nothing happens. Yeah. And that,
I'm 100% with you on that point. I just think the chronology, and listen, thank you for your call, Mark. I think the chronology of this, 29th of July, was when this horrific, murderous event happened in Southport. The riots happened on the 30th of July. So it was a day later, and that was hardly, it's even possible at that point that even Keir Starmer didn't have the details of ricin and God knows what else that might have been found. Believe me, a previous Home Secretary made the point that, you could be 24, 48 hours before you get a fuller picture, even as the Home Secretary. Not defending the police or anybody here, but that might well have been the case, because we don't know. His name came out on August the 1st, so 2 days later, and that was after the riots in Southport. Now, did the name come out because of the kind of problems that were happening all over the country in terms of riots and all sorts of other things? I don't know. 0344 499 1000. This comes in from Russell, who says, we don't need a third, this is reference to the runway, we don't need a third runway at Heathrow or expansions at Luton or Gatwick. The simple solution is we reinstate Doncaster Robin Hood Airport and push a huge expansion from there. Britain's largest runway, one of only 3 in the UK that could take an A380 when it was introduced without requiring an extension on the runway. Then everybody from the Midlands up wouldn't have to travel to London and congest the area even more. Simple, says Russell in Derbyshire. Thank you for that. One in from Gal in Rotherham. Don't forget, terrorism is changing. It's now called individual acts of extreme violence. Paedophiles are now called minor attracted people. And my auntie is now my uncle. God, I hope Trump's plans work and spread to the UK, says Gal. Thank you for those. 0344 499 1000.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
It is Talk, 0344 499 1000. Just gone 2:30. Let's have a look and continue on this story. Counter-terrorism is the order of the day after that speech with Starmer this morning, followed up by Yvette Cooper this afternoon. She says she'll be asking the public inquiry into the Southport stabbings to also consider the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. It's emerged that 18-year-old Alex Rudacubana, who pleaded guilty to murdering 3 girls yesterday, was referred to the anti-terror programme Prevent on 3 occasions. Starmer has said he will change the law on terror if needed. Let's speak with Chris Phillips, former head of National Counter-Terrorism. Afternoon to you, Chris. Good to have you with us. Just give us an overview on this. We've got a programme called Prevent. It's meant to spot a wrong one when we see one. It clearly failed here because this fellow was reported 3 times. Do we need something new, or do we just need the current system to work properly?
Hello, Ian. Nice to speak to you again. It's an interesting one, this, actually, because terrorism has a definition. And this falls outside of that definition. The first part of that definition is all about committing violence, etc. And absolutely no doubt he did that. He committed murders and things. But the motive has got to be to change government policy or to scare the public. And in that, he probably falls short on this occasion. And that's the issue that's been dealt with here. And the simple fact is it doesn't fall within definition of terrorism. The interesting point is that he'd already downloaded this document, which is a terrorism offence to download that, and he also had writing, which is of course also a terrorism weapon. So these things are the issues. What we have, I think, is someone that fell between the cracks between terrorism and extremism, and no one picked him up. And there is always a problem when someone is a dangerous person, but they haven't done enough to arrest them yet. And that's where this person was, I think, prior to the incident. So what did you think, Chris, that Prevent is meant to do? Because you're right. I mean, there's lots of people get referred to or reported to Prevent. Sometimes it turns out that it was an over concern that was not founded. And it might come to nothing. But if you've been reported 3 times, then you'd think, well, there must be what's meant to happen to that person after that? Because they might not have committed a crime. They've just been sufficient suspicion from either an employer or a teacher or a neighbour or whoever it happens to be. It's sufficient concern to flag something up. What is supposed to be the next step? Well, he's supposed to be reviewed by social services and by the police. Basically, it's a system which allows social services, police and all to get together to basically persuade him away from violence, extremism. And, oftentimes that has worked. And there's no doubt that the Prevent strand has saved lots of people from turning into terrorists. It's not going to save everyone. It's not going to stop everyone. But this person, I think, from what I gather, and I'm only picking this up from the news today, is that the Prevent strand said, well, he's extremely violent, but he's not effectively a terrorist. And it then falls over to social services to deal with him in that way, or perhaps the mental health teams. And he's fallen between the cracks. But it is a difficult thing, where they had the situation where his dad reported the fact that he shouldn't get into a taxi because he was going to go back to the school to commit offences. If he goes back into his room and he then says he wasn't going to commit offences, it's a difficult one to deal with from the police perspective. Yeah, it's spot on. And I suppose the difficulty is that if you were meant to monitor, therefore, every single person that's on the Prevent programme, well, you'd be there all day, right? I mean, we've seen it many, many times. People who even known to, authorities, they were known to the intelligence services, they were known to the police. You can't monitor everyone. You can't guarantee 100% that this won't happen again. No, and this person, I mean, horrendous. Look at the state of him. I mean, he's scary just to look at. It's clear that he had some mental issues. I'm sorry, and I do understand people when they get upset to say, well, of course it's a mental health issue, and no sane person would do this.
Yeah.
But we have got rid of a lot of our ability to deal with people with mental health issues. We used to have, lunatic asylums, as they used to call them in the old days, mental health assessments on people that should lock them up to make sure that they are safe. It doesn't happen as much as it should, and it clearly didn't happen in this case.
And again, going forward, what does an inquiry do, Chris? I mean, what can it realistically achieve? We can, I can hear the cliches flying out of that room already. Lessons will be learned. We will monitor this. We will change the name. We'll appoint somebody with a new heady position on a six-figure salary. Will it change anything?
Well, it needs to, I'm afraid it needs to have resources. It's like the whole criminal justice system, social services system. They've all been run to the ground. We need to be locking these people up before they commit offences because they are a danger to society. There's a reluctance to do that for many reasons, one of which we haven't got the prison places, we haven't got the mental health places. But we do need to have the resources in place to deal with it. But it does flag up. And this was flagged up by the head of MI5 just a couple of months ago, the fact that we have got a huge number of very young people, 13, 14, 15, who are sitting in their bedrooms becoming more and more extreme, not necessarily around terrorism, but around violence. They're viewing horrendously bad things on the internet. And some of them go off and commit offences. And if you take this as being similar to one of the school shootings in America, not all of those, in fact, very rarely is that a terrorism attack. It's just someone that's gone off the rails completely and lost the plot. And we've got to find a way of dealing with those people.
Indeed. Chris, thank you as ever. Chris Phillips, he is former head of National Counter-Terrorism, the security office there. Thank you to him. Thank you to Sean, who says, Dan from Portsmouth was right about a bloke being arrested for carrying a knife while there was a vigil taking place in South. You're quite right, Sean. There was somebody that was arrested. I'm not sure that was what the catalyst for the riots, by the way. I think the idea that somebody that bit of information suddenly got out to mobilise God knows how many hundreds of people to suddenly pitch up and kick off. But nonetheless, either way, I think we can separate people who rioted, torched, beat up cops from those that have genuine concerns. And that's been the bit for me. Somebody here called Just Me on social media says, been listening to you for a number of years, still can't quite decide what side of the fence you're on this, Ian. But regardless of that, try to understand that Indigenous Brits feel they've been abandoned by the establishment, hence the anger and frustration. And that's the bit that I'd like to think I've championed all the time. Whenever you get a contentious issue, by the way, and I've done this job long enough to know that the truth of the story is likely to sit somewhere in the middle of these things. It's never really all of that or all of that. In fact, almost never is it that. And so I think journalistically, and I hope this addresses the point of where I sit on this, I think you can have more than one thought rolling around. Now, in my job, you can be contentious and more contentious by rigidly sticking to only one line, whether it's a left-wing line or a right-wing line, and you don't move. You don't move. And folk who support you absolutely love you for it, and folk who hate you will probably still listen because they want to feel that sense of their annoyance quota has been fulfilled for the day. But you don't often get to any kind of truth on situations such as that. There's some things that are clearly unequivocal. I think on this, it is multifaceted. I think there's genuinely, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, as it were. I don't know what Starmer I genuinely don't know what Starmer should have said. His far right comment, which I think we should slightly separate from much of this, it was so bizarre and unnecessary. Look, he's a lefty. I know why he said it. but it was always going to create a bigger problem than the one it purported to solve, and that was the trouble. And then he went again, didn't he, on the grooming gang thing when he talked about jumping on a far-right bandwagon. It's like, mate, have you got no idea what is going on in your own country? Yeah, you can condemn rioters. I think what people extrapolated from that, and as time goes on, we're extrapolating it even more and maybe making it look worse than it ever could have been by suggesting, you know, this bloke had nothing to say about a man who murdered 3 girls, but loads to say about people who protested against it. That's the headline, and that isn't quite what's happened here. Sorry, that's just a fact. This one comes in from Howard. I do believe the Prime Minister failed totally on Southport. He and the Home Secretary went to Southport to lay flowers. Why was he laying his flowers? The crowd were asking the Prime Minister, what now? How many more of our children have to die? All before a brick was thrown. His choice was to turn his back on them and treat them with utter contempt. He had not spoken to them, I believe. Had he spoken to them, I believe what followed may well not have happened. I've never heard anyone connect that it was his visit to Southport. And I'm not sure the people who were queuing up there were the same people rioting. I think there was a time where you didn't really want to see Keir Starmer or any politician there, to be honest. Andrew's in Hertfordshire. Andrew, what have you got for us? Hello.
Yeah, I just thought that you spoke really well there, Ian. It's very difficult to actually put across, and you do well because you facilitate the position. The issue with Starmer is actually he could have done better, but you can take the lawyer out of court, but you can't take the lawyer out of the lawyer. So what he had to do was very similar to Boris when he stood up in relation to the COVID. Boris led the nation at that time, whether it was right or wrong that, you know, the first lockdown. If you look at Starmer, he didn't lead the nation. He had to get a grip of it. And that's the great tragedy in this, and you mentioned it very well. It's the line from Diane Abbott. He is not a politician. He can broadcast, he can tell you what to do, because he's preparing a case for someone to defend someone like Jerry Adams or someone even worse. But what he can't do is he can't what they call skate. He can't work on his feet. So he had to come out and say, we are where we are, this is the position, this is actually what's going to happen. But he couldn't do that. And he it's not that he's wooden, he's not used to doing anything other than working in a straight line. And that's where you're interesting, and even wretched other people on other forums. You actually see the nuance of it all. And at the end of these things, he needs to take questions and be able to be empathetic. And then what we forget is the victims, it's beyond anything you can understand. And then you forget the people that are recovering now. And I think genuinely that he is responsible for those riots. The people that did it, wretched, awful, you know, kill them, cut them in half, bury them in HS2. But he had a chance there to lead. And if you look at when the Queen would speak, and when she would actually bring an element of common sense to it, and he hasn't got the common touch. And
he's not, and it comes to something when we have to cite Diane Abbott, doesn't it, as a reasonable voice on observation. But it's true. He's not a politician. He just doesn't do that stuff very well. And he could have got a grip of this and said, you know, I wanted to hear him. You know, Theresa May was also a good example of, you know, not a politician. When Windrush happened, Andrew, remember all of that? She could have come out there and gone, right, I don't know what's gone on here, but I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I'm going to find out. I'm going to give you answers. You want that kind of and mean it. You don't get that from her. You certainly don't get it from Keir Starmer, and that's where his big failure was.
Yeah, 100%. And the great tragedy in this is that it's actually alienating people more and more from politics, but equally, every failure writes the manifesto for reform. It's actually, you're looking at it now thinking, this actually cannot carry on like this, because if you were in the Labour Party now, imagine he was a presenter on Talk that was doing, say, the breakfast show, and the numbers are going through the floor. No, seriously, we'd all get together and say, you know, that Mike Graham, we're done with him. You know, he's taking food off our table.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it's the Keir Starmer show on breakfast right here on Talk from Monday morning. Can you imagine? Great call, Andrew. Thank you for the kind words as well. Really appreciate that. Alan says the legal definition of terrorism is too restrictive. It should be an act that causes terror, not just acts motivated by a religious or a political cause. We were talking about that in the office. I mean, you could say any scene of carnage is an act of terror in many respects. If you walk into a house and shoot people, sadly these kind of stories happen, and it turns out to be a former partner or a disgruntled boyfriend or whatever. They're not usually called. It's not usually called terrorism in the way we understand it. But it's an act of terror, right, by definition. But terrorism is a bit more specific, and they didn't pin terrorism on this Rudy Cabana character in terms of the killing. They found the manual and the ricin, which looks like lone efforts on his part to do something. They were acts of terrorism, but the killing turned out not to be. And I don't think the court would have any reason to not want to make that work. And I'm sure the police, when they put their files to the CPS, would have been in full consideration. Is this man acting as a terrorist in the conventional sense? And if there isn't any evidence to show that, then you're not going to be charged in that respect. Whereas I think our previous lawyer guest said that the killers of Lee Rigby, where that was not just an overt act of terrorism, and for anybody who remembers that, the incredibly, again, horrendous and distressing pictures of these two killers standing in the street with blood on their hands of somebody they just killed, and then giving their political reasons why they had died. They weren't denying anything. There is clear act of terrorism. 0344 499 1000. We'll have more comments from you on the way. Next on Talk.
This is a fundamental systems failure of epic proportions. I think what really concerned me, Mike, was the lack of warmth and affection on his trip to Southport.
Yeah.
It was very robotic. A lack of empathy. It was very robotic and mechanical for me. And I think that you're talking about a very quiet, traditional seaside town in on Merseyside. And they're suffering this horrific atrocity. And the Prime Minister went up there, and I think for me, he displayed a real lack of leadership.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
Alan says Starmer could have said we don't know whether it was terrorism or not, rather than ruling out terrorism. Did he rule it out? I think he only ruled it out when the police ruled it out, didn't he? I may be mistaken. There were so many conferences at the time. Sean says inquiry on the Southport murders hours away after a guilty plea. However, 2 or more decades in and nothing on rape gang survivors. Spot on. Here's one. Starmer could have simply said or released that it was a Welshman that had committed the attack in Southport. But again, you get into that territory. Is that what you want the Prime Minister to do every time? I mean, the information, bizarrely, it was the BBC, of all places, that first clarified the location of where this person was from. I remember that being the case, and that he was somebody who was born here and of Rwandan parents. I think that was, and I remember thinking at the time, I think we all did, wow, they've put that out there first. Police, of course, at the time were urging the public not to spread unconfirmed speculation. But, I think the riots that began, the initial riots, the horror story people that were doing horrible things and terrible things, do the parents of children who lost their lives and were seriously maimed and traumatised for life, do they really think that those rioters in the next postcode 24 hours later somehow represented their feelings or their woes? I doubt very much. I mean, if nothing else, it was massively disrespectful. But it flared up and online did its thing, and before you knew it, it spread. This will be Dave in South Wales. What do you got for us, Dave? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, yeah. Well, the thing is, I think there's too much intervention, too many statements from Starmer. I would rather he said nothing and left it to the people dealing with the problems.
Yep.
The thing is, we don't really need a prime minister to pontificate on everything that goes along. We've got systems and departments to handle these things, and the best thing he can do is show his management potential by letting them get on with it.
True enough. He's always going to be asked about something as big as this, though, isn't he, in a press conference? He's always going to... People will say, look, something big has happened here, something unprecedented, something we've never seen. We want to hear something from the Prime Minister.
Well, you can quite answer it. The Home Secretary will be making a statement. The Chief Constable will be making a statement.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the way Prime Minister...
that's absolutely. I don't really want my Prime Minister giving nuanced comments on ongoing cases. I want him to butt out of the rule of law, even though he was quite animated on the kind of people that are concerned about grooming gangs and the like. Great call, Dave. Thank you very much indeed. Dave in South Wales. We'll talk to Anna shortly. We've got the voice of doom, by the way. This is day 9 or 10? Come on, somebody must know. Day 9 or 10? Is it 9? 10. Day 10. Nobody's got this one so far. It's the mystery voice with a political angle. Here's the voice.
Give me hundreds of examples.
Do not call in. There is no prize, but you can message in on 87222 if you want to have a crack at it. Here's the voice again.
Give me hundreds of examples.
Please, will somebody get this thing correct? You're normally pretty good at this stuff. This one's eluded you for 10 days. If we get a right answer in the next 5-10 minutes, we'll reveal all on the other side of the news. If we don't, then, of course, it rolls over again. Here's the voice.
Give me hundreds of examples.
87222 if you think you know. Anna is in Sussex. Anna, what have you got for us? Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to phone because I feel that we kind of go off course when we talk about the rioters, and we are talking about people who have had enough, who found out that 3 poor girls who went on a day out, their parents at work, were murdered in cold blood. And then rather than having a Prime Minister come out and say, I understand, I get why you're angry, I'm going to do everything I can to deal with this, not just this case, but we've been on high terror alert for so long. We wait for this all the time. And I don't know about you, I have children of all ages, and every time they leave the house, I'm constantly saying, keep your wits about you.
Yeah.
Why do we have to live in fear? Why did he not come out, even when the mosque was being attacked, and stop supporting certain communities, but say, I'm here for everyone, I'm here to keep you safe? He didn't listen.
Because he's not
he's
not a good politician, Anna. That's the problem.
No.
It's not really in his DNA to talk in that way. So he reverts to either cliches or areas that as a left-winger he feels safe talking about. And when he talks about right-wingers, I mean, he might have had a point about some of those people in the riots rather than those that were just concerned. Then he knows that there is a certain amount of Labour supporters out there who will absolutely agree with him. And he thinks, I'm on safe ground, I can get away with this. Anna, thank you for that. And he did the same thing with the grooming gangs. He reverted back to type. Oh, it's only people jumping on a right-wing bandwagon. Can you imagine Trump going there with that? I mean, just think about it in that respect. And then people scratch their head and go, what's all this? Why is Donald Trump back on the scene? Why are Reform UK doing really well? Well, it doesn't take much to work that out, does it, kids? Frankly, you haven't got to be a student of politics to understand it. 0344 499 1000 is where you'll find us. Will we get an answer to the voice of doom after the news? This is The Voice.
Give me hundreds of examples.
I've got a feeling it's going to be another rollover, right? I think it might be. We'll find out on the other side of the news at 3, which is next.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
And afternoon, coming up on 3 minutes after 3 o'clock. Welcome back to the home of common sense, where we thrash it out, chew the fat, debate, and attempt on, I think, a reasonable amount of occasions to come up with a semblance of common sense. Today, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says that Axel Ruda-Cabana is responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history. Well, we knew that, Home Secretary, but she set out details for a public inquiry into the Southport attack. What is that likely to achieve? What do you sense that inquiry looks like? Also this afternoon, Donald Trump has told Americans the golden age begins now. That's a cracking slogan, regardless of whatever you think of him. After he was sworn in as the 47th president, and he's been quick to get to work, of course, he's announced sweeping changes to immigration, the economy and justice. We'll cross and get comment from the New York Post in just a moment. And a fleet of yellow buggies have been rolled out in West London, with the local council hoping residents will hire them to help alleviate traffic congestion. Bizarrely, other than looking like a bit of a numpty when you're in one, seems quite convenient. It's got to be better than an Uber, surely. But then again, isn't anything better than an Uber? Details to come. 0344 499 1000. We mentioned about fly tipping as well, which we will touch on in a bit. One here says the recycling centre near us set up an appointment system, and as a result, fly tipping has increased threefold. We've got the same thing near us as well, an appointment system. Councils are a law unto themselves, with charging already struggling people, so until they sort things out, I'm on the side of the fly tipper. I could never put myself on the side of the fly. I mean, no matter how annoying it is to fill out that form to book your trip to the council tip. The idea that I would take I took a wardrobe down there the other day. Man, did I enjoy smashing that thing up. Is that just a boy thing? I did create I look like I've been crucified on the palm of my hand with a nail injury. But I'm all right with that. Meant I was a proper builder for 5 minutes. And I took that down to the tip. The idea that I would just throw it off a bridge on the A21 would be ludicrous, I'd like to think. Maybe some people are drawn into that direction. So let's go back to it. Donald Trump telling Americans the golden age now begins. He's the 47th president of the United States. And, of course, he was previously the 45th president of the United States. He's got straight back to work. He's signing dozens of executive orders. He's pardoned those involved in the January 6th riots, withdrawn the US from the Paris climate deal, and declared a national emergency at the border with Mexico. Let's speak with Adam Coleman, columnist at the New York Post. Adam, good afternoon to you, sir.
Thank you for having me back on.
Now, of course, presidents are allowed to sign executive orders. He's not the first person to do it, but boy, he's hit the ground running, hasn't he?
Yeah, you can definitely tell he's more motivated than he was his first time around. I think that there was so much that was done negatively during Biden's administration that in many ways he feels not only validated in his claims when he was running for office and he ended up losing to Biden, that there's an issue with the immigration system, there's an issue at the border. And we saw what Biden's fix is for it, and basically to do nothing and actually let it get worse.
Yeah.
To allow illegal immigration to move forward. So I think now, not only is he making these sweeping changes, but I don't think there's as much pushback as if he was to try to do something like this in 2016.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. There is a sense that perhaps even those that wouldn't have previously supported Donald Trump are looking at this going, look, we needed a kickstart. We needed something to happen. And then this new phrase, the golden age begins now, which I think is frankly genius.
Yeah, kudos to his speechwriter.
No, indeed, yeah. I've got a funny feeling somebody came up with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you got a sense, and this was the first time my wife, who's not very political, sat down and watched a ceremony like this of him getting sworn in and saw the seriousness in his face even before he was sworn in. I've been seeing, especially since the assassination attempt, he seems far more serious, far more determined, and far more willing to do the thing that people say you're not supposed to do. Yeah. He just announced that he was going to put some tariffs on Canada and Mexico, a thing that no one would have done before. But there is a necessity to do something like this, at least as a negotiating tactic. So I don't think he's hindered by it. And also the other thing that kind of works to his advantage, he's a one-term president, which has its pros and cons. But the pro is you're not running for re-election again. So you're going to do the thing that you think needs to be done. You believe that the American people want done, and you don't have to worry about how will this look in a campaign ad against you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely right. The executive orders are interesting. It's not a straightforward green light for success, of course. They can be challenged. They can be ratified. There can be all sorts of things happen before they literally become the law of the land, right?
Absolutely. Everything gets checked to see if it's constitutionally sound. There were certain things that Biden tried to do as far as like the student loans. he tried doing OSHA to force people to get vaccinated, which they found to not be constitutional. They can't use OSHA to do something like that. So that's the great thing about our system. There are checks and balances in the judicial aspect as well. But when it comes to something like this, what I don't want him to do is be overly reliant on the pen, because we saw what happened when you do that. He did that a lot in his first term. And as soon as Biden got into office, he undid every little thing that he did. So this needs to be an opportunity, especially with the Republicans holding all three branches. The Republicans need to pass laws. This is the opportunity to do so. So fine, you want to do some sort of executive order for immigration, but there needs to be some sort of solid law that will pass all three branches, and we don't have to worry about this moving forward.
Yeah, there is a sense that some, not unreasonably, have observed that he's throwing too much at the wall here, and you know, okay, some of it will stick. He's creating some mood music. I think we all get that, but he's got a big old to-do list, right?
Yeah, very much so. But one thing I will say is, he seems like he has a plan. I know we're supposed to start with mass deportations very shortly. Last I heard, Chicago is going to be the starting point, starting today. We'll see if that is something that actually occurs. But Tom Holman has been gung-ho about massive deportations of people who are not supposed to be here.
Sure.
There seems to be a plan. He's been acting like the president, to be honest with you, even before he became the president. So I think that there's a plan involved. It's not just him getting in there and just writing this wish list of executive orders. There seems to be far more of a plan. He seems to have more serious people who are around him this time around than previous. So I'm far more optimistic, and I think a lot of Americans, even ones who are on the fence about him, are more optimistic about him this time around than the first.
Yeah, there is that very real sense. And of course, you know, it works or it doesn't work. But one of the things that he has done is kind of injected a real degree of confidence and a sense of positivity, which is crucial, right? And you know, the golden age begins. There it is right there.
Yes. I think if someone, there's always going to be people who are going to be irrational about Donald Trump. There's nothing you could do about them. But the people, and I would say most Americans, are relatively pragmatic and somewhere in the middle. When they listen to him this time around, he's not being as bombastic, right? He's being a little bit jovial at times, but he seems more serious. And I think a lot of Americans were open to having someone who is a relative outsider like Donald Trump come in. But at the same time, they want someone to have some sort of leadership quality, and leaders are to be taken seriously. So I do have a sense that more people are taking him seriously, including world leaders, are taking him more seriously this time around. And I do think that he is showing himself to be more of a leader thus far. We'll see as time goes on. But he's not tweeting every day. He's not getting into bickering fights. He's not fighting with the press as of yet.
Yeah.
But he's focused. He seems more focused, even just in the short term, than he would have years ago.
And Adam, just a final point. I don't know what you made of Elon Musk giving his speech yesterday. He walked on stage. It looked like he just drank a pint of bleach or something. You know, he was dancing around like dancing around like I've never seen Musk move. He was throwing shapes there. And then, of course, he got into a little bit of, well, I wouldn't say hot water because I think it was nothing, but many people suggesting he gave a big rousing speech and then did a Nazi salute. I mean, my first response to that is as if.
Yeah, anyone who's watching it, he's clearly grabbing at his heart and kind of like throwing it into the crowd. This is what I'm talking about. It's the same type of tactic that ultimately has allowed the Democrats to lose, right? And so if the left-leaning media wants to do this, guess what? They're going to continue to die off. CNN is dying off and may one day die soon because of stuff like this.
Yeah.
So if they want to do that, fine. But Americans aren't buying it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that, you know, Mr. Musk may not be everybody's idea of a great kind of figurehead in politics or in the inner circle of Mr. Trump, but I mean, the idea that he would just suddenly out of nowhere become a neo-Nazi, I mean, you know, that's It's just sort of beyond extraordinary. You know, it's like you've got people talking about this, losing their mind over this, as if he'd sort of, you know, picked up a photo of Martin Luther King and set fire to it or something. You know, it was that kind of surety, these people. Oh, he's definitely did this. Well, you know, he definitely didn't. I mean, that's the point. Anyone can see that, but you're absolutely right. One of the reasons why Trump is in office now is because of half-wits that make those kind of daft accusations against people like Elon Musk.
Exactly. And listen, this is going to happen. But I think that there are more media outlets who are waking up. Fair criticisms are warranted. I think American people are fine with fair criticisms. Donald Trump is not immune from it. I voted for Donald Trump, but I might criticize him in the future.
Sure.
As we should, our leaders. But when you have something that's disingenuous, when you're manufacturing something that he said, when you're taking things out of context, editing stuff in a way that's unfavorable, this is the stuff that people are over.
Yeah. Spot on. Adam, great point to finish on. Nice to speak again. We'll speak, I'm sure, in the future. Adam Coleman, he's a columnist over there at the New York Post with a pretty common sense analysis of what's gone on over there. I don't know if you saw the apparently Nazi salute from... I mean, it's just a sort of bizarre... It's almost as bizarre. Remember when Danny Baker was accused of being a racist and literally lost his job for it? It was kind of in that, you know, really? Do you think that's what he meant? You think that's what he was trying to do? Baker wasn't, and neither is Musk. But that doesn't stop people on the fringes losing their mind. Folk discombobulated. I'm hearing people calling radio shows talking about it was definitely a Nazi salute. I mean, would you go there? Even if you were a closet racist, you know, some bizarre Nazi sympathiser. I know what I'll do to keep my Nazi sympathies quiet. I'll go onto the international stage and do a massive rip-roaring speech, followed by the old Nazi salute number. Right. Pav is in Harrow. What have you got for us, Pav? Good afternoon. Well, Pav was there. Has he legged it? Oh. We'll get Pav back, don't worry. Let me do the voice of doom, because we might have a winner on the voice of doom. We might have a winner on the voice of doom. Remember, before the news, it was day 10. We played you this voice.
Give me hundreds of examples.
Who is that? It is not Louise Hay. It is not Sarah Champion. It is not Andrea Jenkins. Nor is it Sue Gray. It's not Emma Reynolds, Louise Powell, Alison McGovern, Diana Johnson or Nicky Morgan. In fact, we still haven't got a right answer. Even though the name has, this was the clue we gave you yesterday, the name has been referenced over the last week. The name was referenced by me, to do with something else, and I think probably referenced in a news bulletin as well. That's a further clue, if you like. Day 11 of The Voice of Doom returns tomorrow. Pav is in Harrow. How you doing, Pav?
Can you hear me, Ian?
Hey, we got you now.
Yay.
Another delay there for a second. I thought, what are we going to do without the dulcet tones of Pav? But you're back.
Thank you very much. Well, a couple of things that I'd make. I've been hearing the calls both on your show and Julia's earlier on. Mm-hmm. And I will preface with what I say with this. You know, we need to be careful. I've looked at sort of Twitter over the last day or so, and people have been making all sorts of weird and wacky allegations as they were. And you and I and most sensible people would say that clearly had to stop, and that should have been called out in the summer, rightly so, when people just basically just making stuff up, presumably for clickbait purposes, because that doesn't belong really in any civilized country, irrespective of how strong a feeling may be. You know, we have to adhere to the rules of law. However, and it's a big however, Ian, the two aspects that I briefly will try to concentrate on. Firstly, Starmer giving that monologue this morning. Now, I appreciate, and I've seen various people, no doubt adherents or supporters, trying to turn around and say, oh, he looked all prime minister and everything else. But the reality is, and it goes back to something you and I have discussed many a time, which is infantilization of society, of the electorate as a whole. Yep. Yes, within the legal process, there are things that need to be withheld. In this case, if someone's normally under 18, unless there's a specific judicial order, it needs to be withheld. Of course, that goes without the saying. But, and it's a big but, the reality of this situation is he has basically come on today and made various claims and made various assertions when trying to answer questions about how he didn't want to jeopardize the trial. I, as an ex-lawyer, failed to see how revealing details once somebody has been charged. So let's fast forward it from the July period to October the 29th when the suspect was charged. I find it difficult to see how releasing minor details or even, some details about the suspect would in any way jeopardize the trial. We've had it even in previous terrorism offences, a Parson Green's bombing, etc., even in the aftermath of the Joe Cox incident. The idea that merely, bringing some of these details more properly into the public domain really is for reporters. And most reporters, you will know, you've been working in the industry long enough, know their limitations and know what they can and can't report. Often when you see these cases unfold, they will say, well, we couldn't report and therefore we can now. So I'm not really sure what has changed today.
Just to interject, Pav, what would that have looked like, though, when you say he could have said something? And bearing in mind, yes, he was charged in October. People were asking him to say something or somebody to say something within hours. What could have been said that would have addressed that concern?
Well, but specifically, the moved away from terrorism-related offences. Now, people say it's the police, but he was absolutely clear-cut, and it's not just the far-right slur. He was clear-cut in trying to draw people away and their attention away from suggesting that this had any sort of links, terror-related or otherwise. Now, I can understand managing that politically in July, but in the aftermath of October, when the chap was charged with, obviously, the biological offences, and they were clearly, a public document at the time, there was nothing that he could or any politician potentially could or could not have said, which would have jeopardised the trial.
Sure,
right?
But I don't think at that stage it mattered, did it? Because I don't think he made any comment by October.
No, but what I'm saying is he's basically made out that he didn't want to jeopardise the trial now, that anything that was said would jeopardise it. I'm talking about the broader point, suggesting that anything, because let's be honest, and before I make the really significant point around Yoke Paul, this needs to be looked at. I appreciate the lawyers as it is at the present time, but the reality is this idea that people are going to be insulated away from social media and everything else is one for the birds. Now, it's still incumbent for a judge to say you need to discount anything else you've heard, fine. But if you don't say something and you aren't more transparent, it does allow conspiracy theories to peddle nonsense and misinformation and disinformation. That's potentially worse, quickly, because I know obviously you're going to go to the break. My real concern was when he said the culture of the sensitivity, cultural sensitivity will be unburdened, words to that effect. In my opinion, that was implicitly accepting that under the previous administrations, the Conservatives, and this one, there has been, and I'm going to say it, I know it's become a bit of a cliche now, a two-tier justice system. Because at the end of the day, before the law, if you've committed a law, whether it's a transgression or something major, your cultural background should be an issue only for a pre-sentencing report, but not in terms of the actual crime you're facing, nor should it really be relevant before that. Because at the end of the day, you can't commit a crime and say, I don't know, I'm Christian, I'm Hindu, Muslim, and that somehow absolves you of the crime. That's just not the way the system works. But by using such platitudes and by coming out with such nonsense, when really what he should have been focusing on was the element of justice and essentially even the police, okay, they can turn around and say nothing, which is fine, but they shouldn't be saying this isn't a terrorism-related offence when clearly there are elements of it, and they were still investigating back July, going back to it. That's the problem. And all in all, what it does is it essentially says to people, and this is why, confidence in the justice system is diminishing, is that it says to people, you can't accept the truth. Well, I'm sorry, it's not for these obscurantists to tell us what we can and can't accept. You and I, no doubt, will have this conversation again. We are adults. There are certain things that we can accept. They may be difficult, but feel free to try.
But then listen, Pav, very thorough, fluent stuff. Thank you as ever. I guess you then get into the problem is, do we then default to the Prime Minister every time there is an incident and expect a certain kind of commentary on it, which is why we asked the question, what did you want the Prime Minister to say? What could he have said that would have apparently satisfied people that, OK, we've got the truth? Because the whole thing went out there, we're not getting the truth, there's something else going on here. And when you look at the story now, what is the bit that was going on here that we didn't know about? We knew that a pathological maniac of 17 years of age had killed children. We knew that much. I don't know how much more would change our feelings on that. We're all horrified and devastated and saddened, and no one alive today will ever forget this incident, ever. Will that ever change? Is there anything that would change that? Would any other information have altered what we feel and know and think? 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
Condolences and thoughts and prayers and love must go out to the victims' families and all those who are directly affected in Southport. This is a tragedy of unthinkable scale. But what we see now from the guilty plea is that there was an element of terrorism involved, and these were terrorist attacks. And so there are real questions to ask about how the government was communicating what they knew in the aftermath of the incident.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
It is Talk, 26 minutes after 3. There it is. Roy in Shropshire says, I'm fed up with shouting at the radio. It's obviously Angela Rayner, the voice of doom. It is not Angela Rayner. We've had a few guesses at Angela Rayner, and it's not Angela Rayner. Princess Safi says, witnesses at the scene of the Southport killing categorically stated the suspect was shouting Allah Akbar. That to me says it was a terrorist attack. No ifs or buts, or have we forgotten that? Look, listen, we've looked into that. There is no it was said on social media, and I know people did speculate on that, but another one of those great stories that is put out there, and before you realise it, you think, hang on, who's actually said this? There are very few witnesses to this attack, by the way. It was, sadly, because of where it took place. And so, we will never perhaps know that bit of information, but certainly the only place I've heard it from an authentic, the only place I've heard it from a place with a lack of authenticity is the phrase I should have been looking for, was social media. And I don't think I can confirm that. Jim's in Worcestershire. Jim, how are you doing?
And I really enjoy your conversation. It was good today.
Thank you.
And also, I wish I was a professional like you. I mean,
don't know about that.
I always wanted to be a professional journalist. Anyway, I didn't do that. I became an engineer. But anyway.
Well, I wish I was an engineer like you, to be honest, Jim. Far less jip and hassle.
Aside from that,
yes,
if I was Starmer, I would have done the Trump. He should have commandeered one of his deputies to say, find out who this guy is, who committed the murders, find out what his background is. I want everything on my desk right now. Go away and do it, and be back in 5 minutes. And then he could have made an assessment on how to deal with it and how to make any announcements. You mentioned the police could have made the announcements early on, and I agree with that. You know, if it didn't need Starmer, it needed somebody to take the initiative.
I mean, they ruled out. I think there were a couple of senior police officers as well, Jim, weren't there, that made statements. It's hard to remember now because this was a little while ago. But at the time,
as a former resident, I love. If you've never been to Southport, you'd love it. You really would. And of course, being a golfer, there's so many great golf courses around there. Anyway, just to say this, that was rent-a-car that turned up. The residents of Southport, I can assure you, would have been quiet and dealt with everything very calmly. They wouldn't have reacted in the same ways. The rent-a-crowd turned up at every meeting. Anything goes wrong in this country now, the rent-a-crowd are there, aren't they?
Spot on.
And so I do think that I believe that the residents I associated with would never have done that. They would have committed. Why would they want to burn hotels down and set cars on fire? No.
Yeah. That isn't. You know, even if you are angered by lots of things going on, then I'm not absolutely sure that would have been the right way. Certainly not in the vicinity of where this horrific incident happened. Jim, thank you. Jim in Worcestershire, and for your nice comments at the start as well, Jim. Jason says, reference Starmer and Cooper's speeches. All I could garner from today's speeches is that the government are desperate to eradicate the thought of Islamic terrorism in the UK with a view to changing the law to anyone who is angry, spreads hate, etc. The Ricin and the Al-Qaeda handbook scream enough to most, but it's like they just want to put it down to almost an incel-like terror. Well, that's going to be key, isn't it? I mean, there are people who do act on their own. I mean, this person was clearly a dysfunctional. The term loner and misfit was used, and frankly, I think that slightly, dare I say, almost romanticises somebody. It garners some sort of level of sympathy. It was much more. This was a messed up person, a very messed up person with previous. There were pointers that should have said this kid could be a risk at some point. 3 reports to the Prevent programme. Going to his older school, violent attacks with a hockey stick. There's all manner, big interest in the London Bridge attacks. The list goes on. This person should have been flagged, and that goes back beyond this government to the previous government, when perhaps the system that Starmer is apparently outlining. You know, we need to reassess what terrorism is. Well, yeah, we may have to reassess that. But I think we need to act on it when we see it. We know it when we see it, right? And we do need to act. Mark in Suffolk says, loving the show, if Trump does nothing else, I hope he helps end these stupid wars and be a counterforce to woke far-left ideology. No one I know can argue that we have progressed in the past few years. We spent so much time talking about all that kind of weird stuff, about gender identity, not just gender identity, it's just identity. Your identity is the big thing. Your identity is what is crucial. And all of that spent so long. If it's contagious, I hope it is, says Mark in Suffolk. And I've heard people who even aren't really Trump supporters make the same argument. So I think he's got some support on that one. 0344 499 1000. We're going to talk fly tipping as well. What a mucky old business that is. Lots still to come. Just gone 3:30. This is Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile. The home of common sense. This is Talk.
It is Talk, 25 to 4. Now, Hammersmith and Fulham Council have introduced 10 bright yellow electric buggies to help reduce traffic congestion. The road legal vehicles, which can be hired via a phone app like e-bikes and scooters, are easy to drive, fully insured and are capped at 20 miles an hour. Meanwhile, a mother of 5 was fined £170 for an overstay after spending just 6 minutes in a car park as she worked out how to pay. Was she in one of those things? Oh, it's a separate story. It's like a random little fact taped onto the end. Steve Berry, former Top Gear presenter, is with us. How are you doing, Steve?
Not bad, mate.
Good. You see, these buggies, they kind of appeal to me because they've got to be better than an Uber. And, you know, I can get the principle that if you don't feel safe on an e-bike or a scooter, get a four-wheeled electric thingy to drive around in. What could go wrong?
They remind me of the Johnny Cabs from Total Recall. Do you remember? That Schwarzenegger movie.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a bit like that, except it'd be nice if they had a sort of... shouldn't we have flying cars by now anyway? Well, we promised that. We're a similar age.
Yeah.
When we used to watch Michael Rodd and Raymond Baxter on Tomorrow's World, they were always promising us flying cars.
They were going to be flying by about 1983, I think, Steve. You know, it goes back that long. What a failure.
Well, I have to say, mate, living in central Manchester, I use the hire bikes.
Yep.
I use the hire pedal bikes that we've got, like the bikes in London that everyone is always going to call Boris bikes. No matter how many times they change the name, they're always going to be Boris bikes. I use those when I come to London. I use the Starling bikes, they call them here in Manchester.
Yeah.
Not Starling. Not
Starling
the
bikes?
leader of our government.
What, are they red?
Well, I use them, but I have not ventured onto one of these scooters. And, you know, I think for the same reason as you, Matt, you wouldn't do it. Because I just feel really, really daft.
Yeah.
I'm a 60-year-old man riding a scooter. I had a scooter going up and down Maudsley Street when I was 3, and I skinned my knee when I fell off it. Not riding a child's toy through the centre of a city where I live and lots of people know me.
But I just wonder, Steve, that bearing in mind we've got a lot of, you know, disquiet over shared road space at the moment, you know, whether it's the humble bicycle, the electric bike, the electric scooter, all of these things. Is the answer to have like these kind of golf buggy things that, you know, clearly do what they say on the tin? Is that the safest option?
Yeah. My missus at the moment is on the other side of the world. Quite why she chooses to live not just in a different country, but on a different continent from me.
Yeah, did you not get the memo?
It is up for some debate. But I've been going over there to Palm Springs, California for about 15 years now to see her. And most people with half a brain have taken to driving around in the metro area in a golf buggy because they've got good weather.
So it does work. I mean, that's obviously a climate thing. There's a bit more sun and, you know, I think you've frozen on us at that point, Steve. But listen, I get the point and point taken. These buggies are... were we able to show a picture of the buggies? I couldn't quite clock, Adam, whether we could see a picture of the buggies as we were talking about them. If we didn't have any pictures of the buggies. OK. Steve is back with us. Go on, you were saying, Steve, that in certain parts of the world this is de rigueur transport.
Yeah, we've got to get away. Here in the UK, we've got to get away from this idea that we just should be able to drive everywhere. I mean, 30 years ago, Ian, I did an item for, am I allowed to say this?
Go on.
Radio 4.
Oh, yeah. Those characters. Still going, those chances, are they?
Well, just about. It was the first thing that I did on the radio, and it was half an hour to myself on Radio 4, which is a bit unusual.
It's all right.
And it was about how to get around Manchester city centre in a car, on a bicycle, in a taxi, because we just got the trams. So we wanted to say, will trams transform? There you go. Will trams transform the way we move about in Manchester? 30 years on from that, Manchester has, in fact, the BBC did a series about this as well. Manchester has probably seen more residential building in the city than any city in Europe. The landscape of the city has been completely changed. But you know what's not been changed by it? The number of roads that there are to move people around on.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything in that 30 years, they've shrunk the road network to deliberately keep people from bringing their cars into the city centre. And I can see the pros and cons on it. But the problem with these little buggies, and I've seen a picture of them, is you'd feel daft. Why can't they make them look cool? Why can't they make a little sort of, you know what I mean?
Pimp them, make them look like the Starsky and Hutch car or something. Bit of red and white.
Or Dukes of Hazzard, or James Bond, like a little one-seater Aston Martin.
Yeah. Absolutely right. But it surprises me, now we're talking about it, Steve, that it's taken that long for somebody to come up with this idea.
Well, because is there any money in it, mate?
Yeah,
this
well, that's
is always
the problem.
issue.
Yeah,
this is always the issue, isn't it? People say to me, oh, why don't the car makers do this? And I say, well, because we seem to have lost the idea, along with all this electric car stuff, where governments have told car makers what to do when they're independent companies whose first responsibility should be to their shareholders, not to a government telling them what to do, unless, of course, that government happens to be the Chinese government. But we haven't got time for that now, have we?
Well, speaking of things that, you mentioned the Chinese government and spying and things that concern people. I was reading about the new digital driving licence stored in a new government app on your phone that could be ready to go later this year. I mean, is there anything to be scared of with that? Because, people suggest, well, it's a start to digital ID and that could lead us down all manner of strange routes. But apparently it could be used as a great way of proving a person's age, and you can prove it on your phone rather than having to have the sort of literal driving licence in your hand.
I always thought it's odd, Ian. Yeah, I can see the argument with people saying, hey, this is basically the first step along the road to saying you have to have an ID card with you. But by the same consideration, it's going to be just more convenient. I mean, I recently changed banks. I won't do this at length, but I've been with the same bank for 40 years. They successively closed 3 branches within where I am. So the nearest one closed, then the second nearest, then the third nearest. Thought, right, that's the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
Walked to the nearest bank to me and changed. But I had a week without my card. Because of Christmas and New Year and all that. It was really inconvenient. I don't know if you've tried it, but I had to take out a bundle of cash and pay for everything
with real money
as I went to make it.
Yeah. I did.
No idea, mate.
Yeah,
how inconvenient that is.
Well, absolutely right. And that's obviously the direction of travel. This is the new government wallet to store digital versions of government-issued documents, beginning with the veterans card, then a pilot of driving licences later this year. Steve, we will watch with interest and speak again, I'm sure, on this one. Steve Berry, former Top Gear presenter. There might be, maybe we could do something on that tomorrow, Adam. I think there could be something in that story about what, because of course every time something that you might be fearful of is always, and I've got no tinfoil hat in this game, you know that, but I am aware that everything that's maybe hazardous to your privacy or your freedoms is always sold to you as something really good and convenient. One of the reasons why CCTV has taken off so explosively, bearing in mind most CCTV that's around in this country isn't owned by the government or even the council, it's private CCTV, it might be on the side of buildings, but now we've all got it installed in a doorbell on your front door. I mean, you did CCTV on your front door, we don't even think of it as CCTV. People look at their phone regularly, you're in a pub with some mates, you hear a ding-dong because their phone's not on silent, and they check it, oh, somebody at the door, bloke delivering a parcel. Fantastic, what could go wrong? Well, you're surveilling the whole street. In fact, in certain parts of America, they have a crime initiatives, like, Crime Stoppers thing, where they give the doorbells in high crime areas to some neighbourhoods for free. There you go, there's the doorbell. Everyone's got a free doorbell. the thing is, you have to give police access to the data so the police can see it possibly in real time as well as you. And so essentially you've got a whole road that's completely covered by CCTV, or whole estates even. And that's the trouble with your digital ID and your digital bits and pieces, I guess. Norman is in Dartford. Back to the big issue of the day. Norman, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Ian.
Good. Fire away. What have you got for us?
I think in this country we have a very serious problem, and it is the lack of trust.
Yeah.
And it started before Starmer with the COVID business, and then we now have a lack of trust in politicians.
Sure.
The police.
Yep.
The judiciary. And I've never known it before like it is now. And
why have we...
The population feel like that.
Yeah, have we kind of manufactured some of that lack of trust? You know, when Trump used to talk about don't trust the media, you know, the media, fake news, all this kind of stuff. And sometimes he might have had a point, but mostly he never did have a point. But there were times when clearly a news organisation hadn't been honest. And I know the American system is slightly different to ours, but that's become a bit of a thing here. Don't trust the media, the mainstream media, this crazy legacy media term that half-wits have started to use. I mean, it's, you know, what does that even mean? But it seems to have taken a grip. You're right.
I don't blame the media for this at all. If you look at the facts of how things were, well, the COVID thing,
yeah,
you know, it was all done on modelling.
Yep.
You know, we didn't know that, and then they were told to model the worst case scenario.
Yep.
By this Burke from Imperial College, was it?
I think so.
Somewhere like that.
That's often where these things come from.
And now you get this business with the Just Stop Oil and wrecking roads that would never have been allowed before, ever. Never been allowed in my lifetime, which is now getting on a bit. And then you move on to, well, this business with the Southport. I don't know if you watched this business in Southport when Starmer laid the reefs or whatever.
Oh, yeah. It was a big story at the time.
I've never seen anyone so cold.
Yeah.
The crowds there. I mean, it's no good saying, well, he should have adjusted them, but he walked in and he laid the reef, his head was down, and he turned round, he never looked at a single person, and he walked away. And people got the impression, I got the impression, was he couldn't give a toss about that.
I mean, I think, you know, I'd like to think as a human and as a father, he would have been as disturbed on a personal level, but as a politician, he's just not a good politician. And I think, and thank you, Norman, for your call, because you've raised a load of stuff there that each point you raised could have been a phone-in itself. You've got to be a better politician today than ever before. It does matter what you sound like. It does matter whether you can deliver. And I think Starmer and co just came in, didn't they, on this sort of slight crest of a wave. It was obvious a month or two before the election that they were going to win this thing. The Tories were in a bad way. They were stale, they were sour, they'd been there too long, they were knackered, they were dead, in fact, as a political party. And the one thing that nobody stopped to ask, I mean, Keir Starmer was quite sort of fluent. Nobody doubted that he's probably a bright bloke in his own world, and he was, you know, had an impressive title over there in the legal world. Nobody ever stopped to say, but is he a good politician? Is he a good communicator? Does he sound like the bloke that's got your back? And boy, if anyone has ever missed that, you know, Theresa May had my back more than Starmer did. Rishi Sunak had my back more than Starmer did. I got that sense. I don't get that with Starmer at all. I think he's living in a strange kind of groupthink world of press releases and special advisors, and has forgotten that what people are looking for is authenticity, sincerity, and a plan as well. The man is lacking in all of those things with bells on. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
He's admitted, yes, he did know about the terror links at the time, basically, when he was telling everyone else we were far right. That's what he was doing. Anyone who was angry, not just people throwing bricks, people writing stuff online, people questioning whether there was a conspiracy, was a cover-up. He says there was no cover-up. But he knew when he told people they were far right, when people were being convicted for some of the things they'd written online about this case, that there was a terrorism link. He admitted, yes, this was an act of terrorism.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is Talk.
Just gone 10 to 4. Jeremy Kyle's here at 4 o'clock. We'll get a chat with Jezza before the news. Let's talk to Stuart in Wigan. What have you got for us, Stuart? Afternoon.
Well, I'm just a bit fed up of listening to where you talk. I mean, I'm not here to defend the protesters, especially the ones that were, right, you know what I mean, that were burning things or whatever. I'm not here to defend them. But at the end of the day, what you're talking about here is what the government, this government, the last government, the government before that, what they've done. Because they proved to us time and time again that we can't rely on them to protect our daughters. Well, sooner or later, it's going to get like this, and it will only get worse until they start doing what they are supposed to do. And if they don't, they're going to see a lot of far-right people, and they're not going to have enough police, even though they have bent. They're not going to have enough police to sort it out. We will end up sorting it ourselves, and they're the cause of it. And I'm not here defending what happened at all.
But how would a mass riot going forward, Stuart? How would a mass riot tearing the place up, setting fire to mosques and hotels? How would that help?
But the thing is, you see, what you seem to be forgetting is that, you know, the rape gangs and everything else, Pakistani rape gangs. I'm not defending anything they did. I agree with the protest and this and the other, but they went above the protest. I know that, and I'm not trying to defend that. But the thing is, with all the cover-ups that have gone on, and there has been a lot that's gone on, I can see why people are getting a little bit fed up, because there's a big difference in how the police policed those riots or protests than how they did in Leeds and how they did in London every single week, when you've got all these walking down the street holding terrorist flags, which is against the law. They don't police them.
I think there are some residents in Brixton that will tell you that, you know, robust policing absolutely has been alive and well for different communities.
If you come up to an Englishman, especially one of our generation, and this and the other, but it will go down, and it will go to younger ones as well. If you come up to an Englishman getting his face like that, you're getting it straight back. And you will do every single time. But it's getting worse and worse and worse, because we know that these will not protect us. So it's a case of we've got to protect ourselves sooner or later. And this is in no way, shape or form, because the ones that were trying to burn things are probably the same ones, you know, the people protesters at Black Lives Matter. They were probably the same ones doing exactly the same there. But it suited Labour and Conservatives' agenda at that point.
Well, people were arrested in Black Lives Matter protests as well, but we didn't really have a riot over here with Black Lives Matter. We had, you know, a few fringe moments.
Yeah, not like this there weren't. There's been no arrest really at the Palestinian.
And there's nothing wrong, by the way, with having a protest, but I don't think what we saw after that were protests, really, were they?
I'm agreeing with you. But at the end of the day, this is what they're pushing us to.
There it is, Stuart. Thank you. In Wigan, very passionate stuff that we are on the journey potentially to something worse because people aren't being listened to. I mean, it's very easy to write that off, isn't it, and go, wow, no, it's not that bad, mate. You know, there are genuine concerns. I don't know how Keir Starmer, with a straight face, can talk about keeping the country safe and wanting to draw lines in the sand and learn lessons and stuff, while simultaneously, and bearing in mind we're talking about the fear of the unknown, the new definition of terrorism, while simultaneously letting hundreds of people into a country on boats across the channel. Now, I've got no trucking understanding that most people on a boat, they might be chancers, some might be in a difficult, perilous position, that have escaped a tyrannical regime, and I'm absolutely sure most aren't criminals. You only want a couple, right? You only want one or two, half a dozen over the course of a week. I think the idea that you're going to keep our country safe while simultaneously allowing 30, 40,000 people a year to row virtually into the United Kingdom, mostly young men, average age 23, no identification. All we know is that they've usually come from countries that might be problematic, that might well have a little bit of a history where you'd keep your eye on someone who just turned up without any ID. You wouldn't allow it at an airport for somebody to pitch up and go, can I come in, please? I'll just jump that barrier. I've got no ID. I'm 23, and that's it. You wouldn't allow that. But across the channel, that's fine, apparently.
How are you?
Jeremy Kyle is here.
I do apologise, I've been slightly late.
You almost jumped over the camera then.
Like I'd just come across the channel. That was an extraordinary moment. I've done a lot of broadcasting, but that was extraordinary, taking that speech. I actually sat there yesterday listening to that speech of Donald Trump thinking, oh my God. And I rarely phone this radio station, right?
Yes.
So I've done that all yesterday, and I've watched this man say there's two genders, and I'm a state of emergency on the southern border. I'm dropping pronouns. This is about America. We're going to drill, baby, drill. And then I'm driving on the school run. I've got Mike Graham, brilliant. You know how much I love Mikey, on. And I'm listening to that dreary, miserable, wet piece of rubbish that is our Prime Minister. And I just rang Mike and just went, the difference is it's just unbelievable. Hauled out today in front of the national media, admitting that he knew more than he let on. I mean, complete can of whoop-ass.
We picked up on exactly that. You know, the golden age of America has begun. I mean, what a great phrase. Yeah. It's begun. The positivity, the enthusiasm, and he mentioned, even Trump mentioned it. He nicked our logo. Almost,
oh, I played it all day.
Common sense.
Yeah, I'm going to sue him. This station has been saying the home of common sense for ages, and he says it. You know, that we're about common sense, but just the ability for him to galvanise. Thousands of people that contacted this show yesterday afternoon saying, oh my God, would it not just be great with everything that's going on if you had somebody who was that enthusiastic?
Who sounded like that.
And I was trying to do commentary over pictures, and Denny, our boss, just said to me, good show yesterday, and took a breath and then went, my favourite bit was when you went, there's a bloke in a velvet jacket doing karaoke, or is he singing the national anthem? I've no idea, I can't hear. So there you are. Yeah, listen, two stories in town.
Yeah, absolutely
Keir Starmer,
right.
the Southport